like dropped the tour schedule and the tickets were on sale, I was like, because I went, last time I went to them was 2023, also in Salt Lake, for the Little Tour. And that was the first time. I had like 3 times like planned on going to them, but something came up and I couldn't go. So finally I was able to go that time. Well, I was able to go to the Little Tour, but I wasn't able to go to when they came in town for simulation theory. And then they came once before then. It wasn't, I think, on any particular tour. It was like they were in Salt Lake, and I was like, I was so mad because the time where they came in for simulation theory, like, I had like bought tickets, and I was planning to go with my dad because my mom had surgery. He's like, no, okay, that makes sense. But I was like, come on. I was like, we didn't think about it. Oh yeah, it was a but after 2023 though, I was like, and now I don't want to ever have the opportunity, especially like again, like with this album, like the last album, I think it is. I'm like, you know, like I've got.
Okay, I think we're going to begin. So if everyone could please take your seats, we can get started. Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Patrick Newman. I'm the other Newman, no relation to Jonathan Newman. It's a pleasure being here at Mises University 2026. My first Mises University was in 2011, all the way back in 2011 as an undergraduate. It's a real pleasure to be speaking at this event now. So I'm excited to be presenting on the Austrian theory of the business cycle. And this is a sort of a canonical part or component of just Austrian economics. So it's really important that we understand the fundamentals here. So for those of you who haven't seen my presentations before, I always like to start off with a little bit of a roadmap, right? What's this presentation about, and why does it matter? Okay. So what I first want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the Austrian theory of sustainable growth, right, and how it's driven by lower time preferences. And we learned about this in Dr. Swick's presentation on Austrian capital theory. I want to talk about that for a little bit more for reasons I'll get into. And then I want to spend the bulk of the presentation on the Austrian theory of unsustainable growth. And this is the theory of the boom and bust business cycle. So sustainable growth means it can be maintained, right? The same thing can be happening, right, given the underlying data. Unsustainable growth means it can't last, right? It's a temporary sugar high, let's say, right? And when we're looking at this Austrian theory of unsustainable growth, there's a couple questions I want to answer that we're going to, a couple questions I want to raise, that we're going to answer throughout the course of this presentation. What causes the boom, right? What causes this period of abnormally strong growth, right? Why does it occur? Why does it not occur sometimes? Why does the boom continue? If it's a temporary sugar high, then how can this boom last for several years? All right, what keeps the boom going? And then what causes the bust or the, what might be called now the recession? So you have a boom, then you have a crisis, as we'll talk about, and then you have a bust. It's a boom, crisis, bust cycle. So these are questions that Rothbard raises in Economic Depressions, Their Cause and Cure. It's a short monograph. It's very introductory. If you're interested in this material, I highly encourage you to read it. It's you can find it online for free. You can also get it at the Mises bookstore. And as Dr. Salerno likes to point out, notice it says Economic Depressions, Their Cause and Cure, right? It's a monocausal theory, right? Mainstream economics thinks that depressions can be caused by all sorts of things. The Austrian School of Economics says that there's a single cause, and that's going to be credit expansion. All right, so what are we trying to explain when we talk about the business cycle, when we talk about the boom-bust business cycle? So the modern business cycle has 3 main characteristics that we want to try to understand. All right, the first is that the boom experiences monetary-induced changes in overall prices. Right? During the boom, other things equal, prices across the board are going to be rising. Now, they're not going to be rising by the same amount, but they're certainly going to go up. This is what mainstream economics would call inflation, what we as Austrians might just call price increases or price inflation, right? Why? Why is this occurring? We're going to answer that. We're going to investigate that. The second characteristic is that the boom and the bust show large swings in the capital goods industries, right? What might be called the higher order stages of production relative to consumer goods industries, the lower orders. So by swings, I'm referring to swings or changes in production in prices. So in the boom, right, there's a larger increase in the production in prices in the capital goods industries relative to the consumer goods industries. It's a bit misleading to say that the higher orders refer just to capital goods industries, things like machines, software, construction equipment, building constructions, and so on, versus consumer goods. Think of clothing, food, maybe car production, and so on as the lower orders. It's a bit misleading to say that you have that all of the higher orders are, we're just call those capital goods industries and so on, but it's for pedagogical purposes and for purposes of simplification. So during the boom, capital goods industries grow more than consumer goods industries, and then during the bust, capital goods industries contract a lot more than consumer goods industries. We want to understand why that is the case. And then the third characteristic is that the crisis is marked by a cluster of entrepreneurial errors. So you have a bunch of entrepreneurs, capitalist entrepreneurs, they're making mistakes that you normally wouldn't expect in the market economy. Because on the market, on the free market, errors, of course, occur. Businesses suffer losses, they go bankrupt, but they're sort of they're minimized. Right? There's a tendency for them to be minimized because of profit and loss, because of competition. But during the business cycle, all of these entrepreneurs all at once kind of screw up. And they sort of realize that there were all of these bad investments at the same time. Right? Why does this occur? How could you have all of these entrepreneurs screwing up at the same time? That's what we want to, we're going to try to figure that out as well. Okay. So how are we going to explain these characteristics? Well, what we're first going to do, as I've mentioned, is we're going to look at sustainable growth. Right? We're first going to look at sustainable growth before we look at unsustainable growth. And this is a Austrian method of analysis. A lot of times modern macroeconomics textbooks will first talk about the business cycle, then they'll go into economic growth. But the Austrian approach is that we must first explain how an economy can possibly work before we can understand how it could go wrong, right? We have to see how the market economy is going to work at the macroeconomic level, how you will have a harmonious order, and before we can understand what causes it to not work. And this isn't just related to macroeconomics and the business cycle. Throughout Austrian economics and all aspects of its analysis, the analysis of the free market must precede the analysis of government intervention. And this is why Mises and Rothbard in their treatises always had an exhaustive analysis of the free market, and then they introduced government intervention. Because you can see how the government intervention leads to various distortions, leads to chaos, and so on, right? After understanding how the market economy produces order, right? Okay, so this is what we're going to do in our analysis of the overall economy. Okay, so what causes economic growth? We can very simply define economic growth as an increase in production and higher living standards. More stuff's being made, more capital goods, more consumer goods. People are better off, so on and so forth. We've learned about these the causes of economic growth before, just to talk about them really briefly right now. You could have an increase in the labor supply and natural resources. That can lead to economic growth. You could have technological innovation. New ways of making things are developed, right? Artificial intelligence, the internet, so on and so forth. That leads to economic growth. You could have improvement in free market institutions, in the rules that govern the use of private property rights. And that's very important. You might say that's fundamental. But from our analysis of macroeconomics, given the free market, what's really the most important thing for economic growth is not the increase in the labor supply, not technological innovation, but an increase in savings, right? Lower time preferences, as we'll see. So the reason why we are wealthier now in 2026 compared to 1986, compared to 1956, is that we have lower time preferences, we are saving more, and as we'll see, the production structure, as a result, has become more roundabout, has become longer or lengthier. All right. So, armed with this knowledge, we can analyze, how the Austrians would view, the effects of an increase in savings. Before doing so, I want to just pause for a moment and just take a step back and see how this is different from modern macroeconomics. The macroeconomics we might have learned in, say, principles of macro, or maybe intermediate macro, and so on. So, modern macroeconomics focuses on labor and spending aggregates, so these various totals. It's very aggregative analysis. It looks at the unemployment rate, right? It looks at the inflation rate, inflation as measured by the price level, okay? It looks at total spending, nominal gross domestic product, right, and GDP. And it looks at real gross domestic product, right? So real GDP. So nominal GDP is the amount of money spent on all final goods and services, and real GDP is basically that spending adjusted for inflation. And then there's various sorts of benchmark indicators. We can look at the unemployment rate, compare it to the so-called natural rate of unemployment. Most central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, has a inflation target of 2%. We also have real potential GDP. Right, this is how much the economy should normally be growing. And modern macroeconomics or modern macroeconomic policy is really just the central bank adjusting the interest rate. It's a bit more complicated than that, to achieve its various objectives. If inflation is too high, well, the central bank is supposed to raise the interest rate. If unemployment's too high, the central bank is supposed to lower the interest rate. And from there, we can stabilize the economy. So while using aggregates has their uses in economic analysis, Austrians would say it's not the most important thing by far. And in fact, it can actually be quite misleading to just focus on these aggregates. Right? So one of my favorite quotes from F.A. Hayek is the following. Right? Mr. Keynes's aggregates conceal the most fundamental mechanisms of change. Right? This is a quote from Hayek's review of Keynes's Pure Theory of Money, which was Keynes's treatise before his much more well-known the general theory of employment, interest, and money. And Hayek totally demolishes Keynes's theory, and he always wishes he wrote a similarly thorough refutation of the general theory, but he didn't. But it's a great quote because it emphasizes a very Austrian point that Austrian macroeconomics is not about aggregates, but it's about changes in the composition of those aggregates. Right? Austrians don't care about the price level per se, they care about relative prices. They don't care about GDP per se, they care about how the components of GDP are changing, right? So just remember this. If you know this, you know a lot about macroeconomics. Mr. Keynes's aggregates conceal the most fundamental mechanisms of change. Okay, so let's jump into Austrian macroeconomics. This is known as capital-based macroeconomics. So capital-based macroeconomics analyzes the relationship between time preferences, the pure interest rate, and the structure of production. Right, there's a bunch of terms here. We've learned about some of these before in our lectures on economic growth, on the interest rate, on capital theory. I think it's helpful to just sort of briefly kind of summarize and condense all that information on this slide. So time preferences, as we know, is the premium on present consumption over future consumption. And in macroeconomic analysis, it refers to the proportion of consumption spending to savings and investment spending, right? So it's the proportion of money allocated to consumption in the present versus money allocated to consumption in the future. Because when you save and invest, you're basically doing that so you can consume in the future, right? We have the pure interest rate, which is determined by time preferences, and it refers to the average or underlying rate of return in industries across the production structure. So abstracting from profits and loss and risk and things like inflation, there's an underlying rate of return in a percentage, in percentage terms across all industries, and that is the pure interest rate. More specifically, it's really a rate of price spread, right? The difference between the prices that capitalist entrepreneurs have to pay for various factors of production and the prices of the output that they produce and sell, right? That's the pure interest rate. And it's important to note that the interest rate in the loanable funds market is actually subsidiary. A lot of times we think of the interest rate as being determined in financial markets, but actually the rate of the cost of borrowing money that we might see in a loanable funds market, that's a reflection of the price spread in the economy, or the rate of price spread in the economy, right? So just something I want to note, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on. And then last but not least, we have the structure of production, which refers to the temporal process of moving capital goods from the higher order stages, from the so-called capital goods industries, through the lower order stages, the so-called consumer goods industries, until the capital good, it keeps getting transformed until it is sold as a consumer good to consumers. So it's the temporal process. You think of it as a temporal pipeline, right? All the consumer goods that we buy and we take for granted, there's been multiple stages of transformation that have taken years upon years, right? And we don't really see it, but it's crucial for our understanding of the macroeconomy, right? So this is really the main components of capital-based macroeconomics: the relationship between time preferences, the pure interest rate, and the structure of production. So I'm sure I have an idea what all of you are thinking, and you're saying, well, that's a lot of information. Can it be expressed graphically? And I would say, well, I thought you'd never ask, right? Because I'm sure that's what's on all of your minds right now, right? And yes, it can. And so we've seen this before, but it's good to just, one more time, but with feeling, right? So we have our structure of production. We have our stages of production on the x-axis. We can call the x-axis. We have the stages of production, the higher orders and the lower orders. On the y-axis, what we can call the y-axis, we have consumption spending. And in the highest order stage of production, we have a certain amount of money being spent on capital goods and land and labor. And the capitalist entrepreneurs, they buy these factors of production, they transform them, and then they sell them to another capitalist, right? And the rate of return they earn is sort of the difference between the prices, the rate of price spread. That's the black line. It doesn't go all the way up to the top, because the capitalist in the next stage now needs to buy additional land and labor to transform the capital goods further. And this continues on, and we have these nice looking bars, and we have our structure of production, because the capital goods are transformed. Capitalist entrepreneurs keep buying the capital goods. They hire more land and labor factors. They transform it until the goods are finally sold to consumers, right? So this is the pipeline, right? We can simplify this even further with a nice trapezoid, right? Where it's pretty similar to what we have before. We're just not showing all of the bars. And the diagonal line is the pure interest rate, because it's the underlying rate of return throughout the economy. And the area of this trapezoid represents the total amount of money spent. And this is the Hayekian trapezoid, a Hayekian triangle. I find the trapezoid is helpful because you can show changes in nominal spending more easily with a trapezoid than a triangle. But anyway, so we have our Hayekian trapezoid, we might say, our really nice overview of the macroeconomy, of the structure of production. Okay, so when people have lower time preferences, what happens to the structure of production? Right? People have a lower premium on present consumption, which means they are more willing to save. They value present consumption less relative to future consumption, and that means they are going to decrease their proportion of consumption to savings and investment spending. So people are going to say, well, we're going to cut down on consumption now, and we're going to save and invest our money so we will be able to consume more in the future. Right? This is why people engage in retirement, right? They save for retirement, right? All right, so how is this going to affect the overall economy if this is happening through most individuals, right, or a significant part of individuals, right? All right, so what's going to happen? So we have our diagram here. And let's say there's a decrease in consumption. Well, this is going to lead to a decrease in the demand for the lower orders, right? Because the amount of money spent on consumption is going to go down, and that means there's going to be a decrease in demand for the capital goods that are producing consumer goods in the near term, right? And we can see how this is going to look. All right, look at that. All right, and that's going to lead to lower prices in the lower orders, right? So it looks like spending's decreasing throughout the economy, but we got to remember that at the same time, savings are going up. Right? People are either directly investing it in businesses or they are saving their money and putting it in financial markets, in the loanable funds market. So the supply of loanable funds increases, and that's going to lead to a decrease in the loan rate of interest. It's really just sort of reflecting what's going to happen in to the pure rate of interest, all right? Businesses are going to use that money, they're going to borrow, they're going to use that money, and they're going to increase spending in the higher orders. So there's going to be an increase in the demand for capital goods industries, and that's going to push up the prices in the higher orders. All right, so we'll see the economy change, right? Now you're actually going to see spending increase in the higher orders. An additional stage or two in the production structure will be added. The production structure is going to get longer, right? The pure interest rate is going to fall, right? So just something to note that when time preferences fall, the higher orders are affected more than the lower orders because of present value discounting. Due to compounding, a lower interest rate is going to increase the profitability of the higher order stages relative to the lower order stages. So you see the economy basically readjust itself. It's going to be producing more capital goods right now. And all of this is happening in phase one, or what we might call round one, okay? And we are assuming that time preferences, they don't keep decreasing, but they remain at their new lower level. Because all that money that capitalist entrepreneurs are going to be spending in the higher orders, it's going to go to people in the form of wages, in the form of rent for land, in the form of profits for capitalist entrepreneurs, and they're going to spend at their lower consumption to investment proportions. And phase two is going to be the exact same thing as phase one. So the economy will sort of continue to transform. The stages of production will be completed, and the supply of capital goods is going to go up. That's then going to lead to an increase in the supply of consumer goods, and that's going to lead to lower consumer prices. So this is ultimately why we have economic growth. Lower savings has been leading to a longer structure of production, right? More capital goods. It's going to actually lead to more consumption in the future. But we're able to consume more by spending less on consumption because prices are lower, right? So this is why we have higher standards of living in 2026 compared to 1986, compared to 1956, compared to 1856, so on and so forth, okay? So how do we get the business cycle? Where does the business cycle fit in? It's important that we go through this because we can see how the market works. Now we got to look at, all right, how does the market not work, right? How do things get screwed up? Right? Well, we get the the business cycle because policymakers think that they can short circuit this process. They say, well, why do we have to wait for people to save? Why do people have to save anyway? That's painful. You have to decrease your consumption. Wouldn't it just be easier if we printed more money, right? Instead of the public saving more, well, you just get the central bank to promote credit expansion, to increase the money supply by making more loans. This is how of course, the fractional reserve banking system operates. And the central bank could just pump more reserves in or use some of its other monetary policy tools. And this is then going to lead to an increase in credit expansion throughout the economy. The money supply will go up and, well, we can decrease unemployment and stimulate real GDP. And it'd be even better if we can do that before the next election. Right? So then everyone's happy, people get reelected, and we can say, look, we're making us all more prosperous. So we have to ask a question that people have been raising for hundreds of years. Can expansionary monetary policy, credit expansion, permanently lower the interest rate and lengthen the structure of production? Can it do what lower time preferences do? And the answer is no, right? We might think that, we might hope that, but it doesn't. It can only temporarily lower the interest rate and temporarily lengthen the structure of production. It creates an unsustainable boom that leads to a bust, right? This is Austrian business cycle theory, or the Austrian theory of the business cycle, one of the most defining theories in Austrian economics, right? So we're going to return to our structure of production diagram. We're first going to look at a simplified scenario. When you have a one-shot injection of credit, right? You just like one dose of credit expansion. Then we'll look at a more realistic scenario where you have multiple doses of credit expansion, right? So right here, I put pure interest rate under the diagonal line for reasons that you'll see, so I give myself more room. But other than that, it's the same diagram. So instead of having lower time preferences, let's just say you have an increase in credit expansion. The central bank pumps more money into the economy, right? The supply of loanable funds goes up, right? The amount of funds that can be lent out. And that leads to a decrease in the loan rate below the pure rate of interest determined by time preferences, right? Now, capitalist entrepreneurs, they see that lower loan rate and they say, oh, I can borrow more. Projects that didn't look profitable, now they're going to be profitable. Right? And they're going to be concentrated in the higher order stages of production. Even if entrepreneurs know Austrian business cycle theory and they think that, well, eventually this is all going to blow up in our faces, they're still going to be incentivized to take the bait. Because if they don't, someone else will. So you just say, oh, I just got to play the game for a little bit, but I'll get out in time. Of course, when everyone thinks that, someone's going to get burned, right? So that's going to lead to an increase in the demand in the higher orders. And how it's going to look is you're going to see the increase in spending in the higher orders, and the consumption does not decline, right? So it looks a little bit different. Right? This is what's happening in phase one, and you see prices go up. New investments are being embarked upon in the higher orders, and they look profitable. The problem is that time preferences haven't changed. This one-shot injection of credit is going to eventually be filtered down to the public in the form of income. And they're going to spend that income at their old proportions, right? Their old consumption to investment proportions. And we're basically going to see the exact same production structure as before. It's just more spending is going to be in the economy. It's going to be sloshing around. So we have something that looks like that, right? So we can see that the interest rate is back to normal, okay? The one-shot injection of credit has petered out, so to speak, okay? And we have malinvestment and undersaving. All of the higher order investments that were embarked upon, right, the investments in the higher order stages were actually unprofitable. All the entrepreneurs screwed up because they were fooled by the interest rate, right? So they're bad investments. The public was not saving enough to make those investments actually profitable, okay? So really, once the crisis occurs, and if there's no more credit expansion, which is the case in this scenario, the bust is the reallocation process. The bust occurs, the recession occurs, and it's a period of liquidation, right? In the higher orders where capitalist entrepreneurs, they need to sell their capital goods at prevailing market prices, at lower prices. They need to lay off some workers. You have unemployment, and they're going to be unemployed until they lower their wages, right? They accept the lower nominal wages. Some businesses will go bankrupt, et cetera. And a lot of macroeconomists, they say, well, this recession is completely unnecessary. The boom doesn't lead to a bust. This is totally unproductive. But the Austrians would say that, no, this recession is actually necessary. You need to sort of clear out the mistakes before the economy can start to sustainably grow again, right? So this, in short, is Austrian business cycle theory. Right? This is the simplified version of Austrian business cycle theory. And using this simplified model, we can explain the cycle's characteristics. Right? Why are there monetary induced changes in overall prices? Well, the central bank expands the money supply, right? Why are there larger swings in the higher order stages or the capital goods industries compared to the lower order stages, right, or the consumer goods industries? Well, it's changes in the interest rate, right? That's why the capital goods industries expand more during the boom, and that's why they contract more during the bust, okay? And then what causes the cluster of entrepreneurial errors? Well, it's the public reestablishing their time preference spending proportions, right? Entrepreneurs, they realize that their investments that they embarked upon were not actually profitable once they realized, okay, there weren't enough savings to complete these projects, right? Even if they thought they could get out in time, some of them are still left, say, they're burned or they're left holding the bag, so to speak. All right. So we've explained the three characteristics that I wanted to explain before, and I set out to explain. And we can now look at a more advanced model of the business cycle. We can look at multiple rounds of credit expansion. Okay. So we are going to return to our trusty structure production diagram. We are going to start where we were at the end of phase 2, right? So we have the initial credit expansion, the public spending according to their old proportions. And so why does the boom continue? Because this won't really take that long, right? Maybe like a couple months, a year. Well, the boom continues because the central bank keeps pumping in money, right? They keep injecting credit. Phase 3 is not the bust. Phase 3 is, well, we're just going to pump in more money, pump in more spending, and we got to keep those higher order stages profitable, right? The problem, though, is that time preferences haven't changed, right? You're just pumping in more money, right? Because phase 4 is, well, it's going to be just like phase 2, except that there's going to be even more spending, right? And we can see how this might go. Right? We could keep drawing another line and then drawing, a following line, and our trapezoids could get bigger and bigger, and then I run out of room, I run out of colors, and then here we are, right? But this is what's really happening. You have multiple rounds of credit expansion. The central bank keeps pumping in more money, and that's pumping up total spending, and that's pumping up total prices, right? So inflation, as understood in the traditional macroeconomic sense, is getting worse and worse, right? This is why we say it's unsustainable, right? The money supply is going to increase at an accelerating rate, right? And that's going to cause inflation to get worse and worse. So why will the money supply start increasing at an accelerating rate? Well, the first thing is that time preferences are actually going to begin to increase. Right? We said time preferences were the same, but now time preferences are going to increase. There's going to be capital consumption. people's proportion of consumption spending relative to investment spending is actually going to go up. We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I could just say right here, when central banks lower the interest rate, they artificially lower the loan rate. That's discouraging savings. The quantity of savings is going to go down because it's like a price ceiling, right? People are less incentivized to save when they're not going to earn as much on those savings. So you will get capital consumption, right? And eventually you'll also get inflationary expectations to set in. People realize, hey, wait a second, prices are just, they're gonna keep going up each year. So what I need to do is I need to buy goods and services now before the prices go up. So there's gonna be a decrease in the demand to hold money. And that's gonna aggravate in inflation. And when the public reestablishes its time preference spending proportions, it's gonna be at an even greater amount of spending. So just as an important point, sometimes people will say, well, increases in the money supply don't cause inflation because sometimes the inflation rate's greater than the growth rate in the money supply. Right? But an Austrian would say, well, no, that's poor reasoning. The money supply growth rate goes up, that leads to prices going up, and then the public develops inflationary expectations, right? So they're expecting the money supply to keep going up. And once you have inflationary expectations and they're getting worse and worse, this is a really big problem. So if this process were to continue, the end result would eventually be hyperinflation, right? Prices just keep on rising further and further. This is the crack up in the currency, as Ludwig von Mises called it, and the economy would collapse, right? This hasn't happened in the United States. The closest we got to hyperinflation was in the Revolutionary War. Long before hyperinflation, most central banks will decide to stop the boom by ending their credit expansion, right? Inflation is going to be too much of a problem. The people are going to complain about it. Politicians are going to complain about it, and central bankers are going to realize, wait, we got to do something. And they're going to stop credit expansion. They might engage in contractionary monetary policy. But once they start to do that, other things equal, well, then the recession is not far off the horizon, right? So this is why we say it's an unsustainable boom that leads to a inevitable bust. Other things equal, the boom is either going to have to lead to hyperinflation or a recession. Okay. So where am I here? Let me see. So just a couple things to note. The business cycle can occur alongside genuine economic growth, right? This is what happens normally, right? You could have the central bank promoting credit expansion, and at the same time, the economy could be growing because of more resources, because of lower time preferences, because of technological innovation, and so on. But it's important to note that what matters is that the business cycle makes us poorer relative to if the credit expansion had not occurred. This is a point made by Ludwig von Mises, right? The economy might still be growing in real time. It's just not growing as much as it could have. Resources are being wasted. So you might not have a recession in the sense of a depression, but you could just have slower growth. It really depends on what's happening at the same time, right? Well, what's happening alongside the credit expansion, right? So the business cycle is always making us poor relative to if it had not occurred. All right. So I want to finish up by talking a little bit about the business cycle in the modern day, right? And tied in with central bank policy. Because once the bust occurs, the central bank often uses expansionary monetary policy to try to stimulate economic activity, right? They want to lower unemployment. They want to boost real GDP. And so they will basically start to cut interest rates, increase the money supply, encourage more credit expansion, and so on, right? But Austrians would say that this doesn't work. Even if it looks like it's working, it's really not going to work. Because what this will do is it will either prop up the malinvestments and delay economic recovery, right? If the central bank is lending to failing banks or to failing businesses, they are not going to go bankrupt. Resources won't be liquidated. You won't see the necessary reallocation of resources. And this will sort of delay economic recovery or lead to really weak growth, right? You're not really ending the recession, you're just sort of stretching it out. It's like instead of popping a balloon, you're just sort of letting the air out really slowly, okay? Or it might jumpstart the economy, but this is going to ignite a new boom and keep inflation elevated, right? It could cause inflation to go back to normal, or it could actually cause inflation to go up, especially if the public has inflationary expectations. And so you're kind of stuck with one of these outcomes. You're not going to get genuine economic growth that's sustainable and that's leading to lower prices of consumer goods, right? And really, these two outcomes have more or less defined central bank monetary policy in your lifetime, because it's true that we haven't really seen that many recessions in your lifetime over the past, let's say, 15 years since the Great Recession. But what we have seen is basically really weak recoveries or above average inflation. So what central banks have done since 2010, right, is they have delayed the sort of the weak recovery after the Great Recession. They've prolonged it. And we had a very serious financial crisis and a serious recession. And then the Federal Reserve and other central banks engaged in quantitative easing after quantitative easing. That propped up malinvestments, and that led to an historically weak recovery after the Great Recession. A lot of times central banks will say, well, we had to do that. We had to bail out all these banks and increase the money supply because the economy was going to crater. And the recession ended in 2009. But realistically, it was an extremely weak recession. Unemployment was very elevated until about 2015, 2016. Real GDP didn't return to potential real GDP until that time. It was a very, very weak recovery because the malinvestments continue to be propped up. More recently, we've avoided a recession after COVID. There was really high inflation in 2021 and 2022. And then central banks were able to lower the inflation by raising interest rates. And we did avoid a recession or a bust, but they never really engaged in enough contractionary monetary policy. And this is why inflation has been above target every year in the 2020s. Right now, the Federal Reserve and other central banks will blame it on supply shocks, blame it on tariffs, blame it on oil, oil shocks and so on. They'll blame it on everything but monetary policy, right? But really, the fundamental cause has been monetary policy is still too loose. So I think it's helpful to divide the recent macroeconomic performance of the United States economy into various eras, right? So from the end of World War II through the 1970s, we had what many macroeconomists called the Great Inflation, because inflation was getting worse and worse. Prices continued to go up, and in the 1970s, you had all of the stagflation. Then after the 1970s, from the 1980s through the 2000s, you had lower inflation, and a lot of macroeconomists said that, well, this is the great moderation, right? We've achieved the economic stability we knew we could get. Reality, this was sort of a great deformation because all this money was being spent in financial markets and blowing up costly asset bubbles, whether in stocks or in real estate, and leading to all sorts of costly bailouts. But what have we been in for most of your life since 2010? I think this name is quite apt. It's not the great inflation. It's not the great deformation. It's the great procrastination, because central banks have been taking longer and longer to achieve their policy goals, right? So this is, I think, a useful sort of shorthand phrase for what's been going on. And I think Austrian business cycle theory explains what's been going on, because central banks have been preventing the necessary recovery from recession, such as the Great Recession, or igniting new booms and leading to higher than desired inflation, right? So wrapping up, we can return to our three questions. What causes the boom? All right. Well, the boom is caused by a central bank's credit expansion. It doesn't have to be caused by just the central bank, but we're just saying it's caused by the central bank. Why does the boom continue? Oh, the answer is because the central bank keeps expanding credit. All right. What causes the bust? What causes the recession? The central bank stops expanding credit. This is really the answers to those questions. It's all based on monetary policy and credit expansion, all else equal. So, in conclusion, capital-based macroeconomics explains sustainable growth, and it shows that it is the result of lower time preferences, right? And this leads to a lengthier structure of production, a flatter price spread, a lower pure rate of interest, right? And capital-based macroeconomics also explains unsustainable growth, and it shows how it is the result of credit expansion. The economy temporarily grows, right? But this is going to come at the expense of reduced growth in the future. It's just a sugar high. The fundamentals have not changed, the amount of savings in the economy and savings rates. So we've shown how the boom inevitably leads to a bust. It's either going to lead to hyperinflation or it's going to lead to a bust. So I think with that, I will conclude. Thank you so much for your time.
Can you see the dot? Is it visible? I think I'm going to use it. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let me get started here talking about competition and monopoly, if you're into such a thing. Okay. So I want to start off in my introduction to this topic of answering this question of why I think this is important. And not that I have my finger on the pulse of most normies. I mean, as time goes on, I feel like I've become more divorced from how normal people think. But it seems to me that many people seem to think that there's this natural tendency of free markets to result in consolidation, that firms get bigger and more powerful, and production gets more concentrated. And as a result of this, consumers are at the mercy of these large firms who can dictate to them prices and quality of goods. And so it's necessary for wise government intervention to come in through the application of antitrust policy, various other policies to encourage competition, to make sure it's maintained. So what I hope to shed some light on within this lecture is whether this vision of things is accurate. So to give you a brief outline of the things I want to talk about today is first this issue of defining what a monopoly is, what counts as monopoly, since oftentimes it's ill-defined and or defined vaguely. After that, I want to introduce, or perhaps reintroduce to you, if you've taken some economics courses, mainstream neoclassical conceptions of monopoly and competition, and then offer some Austrian critiques and alternatives. And then talk about the implications, our understanding of competition monopoly, what implications our understanding has for antitrust policy and how it should be applied or should not be applied. And I want to illustrate this by focusing on Lena Khan, the recent Federal Trade Commission chair, and her paper that she had published prior to becoming chair called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox. And then end things out, if we have time, to summarize Dominic Armentano's work on why antitrust laws should be repealed in their entirety. So getting to this issue of defining monopoly, here I offer the three definitions offered by Rothbard in Chapter 10 of Man, Economy, and State, which he offers a few different definitions. This first definition focuses on the etymology of the word monopoly, basically meaning one seller, a seller of a given good, which seems straightforward enough, but a problem is defining what the good is. Right? If we define it narrowly enough, well, we can find monopoly everywhere. Right? And Rothbard notes John Jones, lawyer, he's a monopolist of his legal services. Tom Williams, doctor, he's a monopolist of Tom Williams's medical services. So it doesn't seem like there's a non-arbitrary way of defining goods. Goods can be subjective, or they are subjective. Different goods with different physical qualities might be perfect substitutes to particular individuals if they serve the same end. And so it's not going to be a very helpful definition of monopoly if we find it everywhere. If everything's a monopoly, then is nothing a monopoly? It's not very helpful. So moving on to the second definition, and this is Rothbard's preferred definition of monopoly, which focuses on the granting of governmental privileges. It says monopoly is a grant of special privilege by the state reserving a certain area of production to one particular individual or group. And as I'll get to later, Rothbard says there's not really any coherent way to conceive of monopoly in a free market. There has to be some kind of government intervention. Without that, we can't distinguish between a competitive price and a monopoly price on the free market. They're just all free market prices. And the third definition Rothbard offers is a person who has achieved a monopoly price. And well, if we accept Rothbard's analysis of monopoly, well, definition 3 just kind of folds into definition 2. If you're going to achieve a monopoly price, then you have to have that state-granted monopoly privilege. So these are some different ways of conceiving of monopoly. Now I want to turn to the mainstream neoclassical view, first of competition and then of monopoly. First focus on the perfectly competitive firm, which you probably or almost definitely have seen this if you've taken any microeconomics course. So here we have a diagram showing the demand curve facing a perfectly competitive firm. In this model, there's a large number, even an infinite number of buyers and sellers, all of which are price takers. They are so small that they have no effect on the market price. A firm in perfect competition faces this perfectly elastic demand curve. They can sell as much as they want at this competitive price, our perfectly competitive price. The demand curve equals the marginal revenue curve. They sell a homogeneous good. There's no product differentiation. There's perfect information, so there's no role for things like advertising. Everybody knows all the relevant information. And so in the long run, in long-run equilibrium, price equals minimum average cost and there is no economic profit. In the short run, it could be the case that some firms have a portion of their average cost curve below the price, in which case they'd be making profits. This is going to attract other firms to enter. Firms whose minimum average cost is above that perfectly competitive price are going to make losses and they'll exit. And so here we have our long-run equilibrium result. And this is considered to be the normative ideal. Resources are perfectly allocated. There's no market power. There's no deadweight loss. This is awesome. However, moving from the perfectly competitive model to I'll call an imperfectly competitive model. This is the situation facing a firm in such a situation. They face a downward sloping demand curve, meaning unlike in the perfectly competitive model in which if a firm tries to charge a price above that perfectly competitive price, they'll lose all their customers, right? Since there's an infinite number of perfect substitutes, anybody trying to charge a price above that will lose all their customers. Here, see, because the firm faces a downward sloping demand curve, they can raise their price above that perfectly competitive price and lose some customers, but not all. And so, as such, they have market power. They have some effect or some autonomy, so to speak, over the price. They'll sell a differentiated product. Product differentiation is allowed here. There are barriers to entry, unlike the perfectly competitive model, which entry and exit is costless. And while this includes those things under definition 2 of monopoly grants by the state, it's not only that. Things like if you're entering a capital-intensive industry, like if I want to compete with Ford or GM, I'm going to need this a lot of capital to enter this industry. And so in this model, that would be considered a barrier to entry. So it's not purely just government coercion that presents a barrier, but things like that. There's imperfect information in this model, so you can have things like advertising, asymmetric information. Like the perfectly competitive model, the profit maximizing quantity is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is right here. However, at that quantity, that Q sub M, the market price that the monopolist in this case can charge intersects the demand curve up at P sub M. So price is greater than marginal cost, and this is considered bad, inefficient, a misallocation of resources that the firm restricts, I put in scare quotes there, restricts output to increase profits. And they'll do this if the demand curve is inelastic over this portion. That is, if the demand curve is inelastic, they can increase their price and increase their net revenue because the quantity demanded goes down by a smaller portion than they raise price. But this is considered bad. We see here these terms of neoclassical welfare economics that we have these deadweight loss triangles. Had this firm been charging the competitive price, right, we'd have a bigger consumer surplus triangle, we'd have a producer surplus triangle. By reducing output, they increase producer surplus by stealing away some consumer surplus. But there's this former surplus that no one gets, and this is considered inefficient, an allocative inefficiency that can be fixed through wise government policy. So these are roughly the mainstream neoclassical versions of competition and monopoly. So turning to some Austrian criticisms, here's what Hayek thinks of perfect competition. So this is quoting Hayek from The Meaning of Competition. He notes that like all these things colloquially we would understand as competitive behaviors are all evidence of monopoly in the neoclassical model. Hayek says advertising, undercutting, and improving or differentiating the goods or services produced are all excluded by definition. Perfect competition means indeed the absence of all competitive activities. So these things these normal business practices that we'd consider part and parcel of competition, those aren't evidence of competition, they're actually evidence of monopoly in the mainstream approach. Some additional Austrian critiques of this mainstream approach is that there's really, it's a mathematical fantasy to have a perfectly elastic demand curve. Each seller contributes not an infinitesimal amount to the market supply, but a discrete quantity. So there's no perfectly elastic market demand curve. And further, all sellers face a downward sloping demand curve in the real world. Any seller you can think of, if they increase their price by any amount, or by a small amount, they're obviously not going to lose all of their customers. So in that way, they have some form of market power. So again, we face this problem of, if we accept this neoclassical definition, monopoly is really everywhere. So that isn't especially helpful. Another criticism is that the only reason a firm would restrict output, and put restrict in scare quotes because it's really arbitrary, whether we consider it restricting or just producing the profit maximizing amount, is that these firms do that because they believe that is the best use of those productive resources, according to consumers, right? It's not like these withheld resources, that they just disappear, that these resources that would have been used to produce what's considered the competitive amount and are withheld if the monopoly amount is produced, they don't disappear. Those are reallocated to other uses. Entrepreneurs reallocate them to other uses because they expect them to be more valuable in those other uses. It's not as if they just disappear. If they were more valuable in the use that's being restricted, then they wouldn't reallocate them. Further, if they were idle, so in chapter 10 of Man, Economy, and State, Rothbard brings up this case, like, let's consider the worst case scenario in which a producer is destroying their output. He talks about a coffee plantation. He says, say they produce 10 million pounds of coffee, but then after doing so, their projections change. They think 6 million pounds is the profit maximizing amount to bring to market. And so they decide to destroy the other 4 million pounds because coffee is a perishable good. This seems pretty bad, doesn't it? He says, well, the only reason they do that is because of entrepreneurial error. If they had known, if their previous projections had been more accurate, they would have just grown 6 million pounds. And so the waste, if we can call it such, I mean, they did the best they could given their limited knowledge and uncertainty at the time. The waste was using the resources to produce the 10 million pounds. It's not the burning of the 4 million excess pounds. And this is responding to what consumers want. If consumers really didn't want that 4 million pounds of coffee to be destroyed, like, they could offer higher prices for those marginal units. But if it is in fact the profit maximizing thing to just bring 6 million pounds of coffee, then they're responding to what consumers want. There's no misallocation of resources here. Further, Rothbard, as I hinted at earlier, he says there's no way to distinguish a monopoly from a competitive price in the absence of legal restrictions. Right? The evidence that mainstream neoclassicals would point to be evidence of monopoly, of restricting output, of raising your price if that in fact increases net income, that's what all firms are trying to do. Everybody's trying to price in an elastic range of their demand curve, or the demand curve for their firm's product. Consumers aren't being exploited here. The shape of demand curves are chosen by consumers. And so they're really just trying to allocate resources in the way consumers want. And just to further drive home this point of restricting output, so here, this is Conor McGregor. This poor guy, you might have seen him, what do they call it, a fight a couple weeks ago. So if you hadn't seen it, he fight lasted about a minute. He came out of the gate with a flying jump kick and hurt his leg, and that was it. So looking over the course of his career, early on he was doing about 3 to 4 fights per year before he got real big. Then it was more like 1 to 2 fights per year. And more recently, it's been 0 to 1, mostly 0. So this was, a big comeback he was making, and I feel kind of bad for him. But we see over the course of his career, he's fighting fewer times per year. He could probably fight more times per year, make more money. Is he withholding output? Or should the FTC or DOJ force him to fight more to increase consumer surplus? Say, well, maybe some would say, well, I don't know, anybody would say, yes, they should do that. We'd say, no, this isn't part of a free society. We wouldn't consider such restriction of output to be in any way immoral or bad. He should be able to decide for himself how much he wants to fight, if at all. Right? This isn't a nefarious way of restricting output. Okay, so moving on to an Austrian conception of competition. What I want to emphasize here is, well, which I did through italicizing and bolding it, is that it's a process. Mainstream neoclassical economics focuses so much on static equilibria that the fact that competition is a process is not within the picture at all. So I'd say competition is a dynamic, rivalrous process of discovery and entrepreneurship in which rivals actively adjust prices, innovate products, and discover new methods in their efforts to win consumer business. Right? There's not perfect information. A lot of things can only be known through the competitive process. And so if we're analyzing things solely through equilibria in which everything is known, we can come to a lot of mistaken conclusions about how things could be improved that we don't actually know in the real world. Further, this competitive process involves advertising, product differentiation, mergers, product innovation, myriad other business practices, that these are all signs of competition, not of monopoly. And so what defines a market being competitive, unlike the neoclassical model, which is a function of how big firms are, how many firms there are in an industry, that's not relevant to the Austrian conception. For the Austrians, it's about whether competitors are free to enter, free to exit, whether there is an absence of legal restrictions on competition and this rivalrous process. So based on our understanding of competition and monopoly, as I mentioned, this has rather large implications for what we think of antitrust policy. So antitrust policy is, say, ostensibly meant to ensure that markets remain competitive and no firm obtains an unacceptable amount of market power. However, it's a bit naive to think this is the case, that this is the reason this legislation, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, was passed. I suggest a couple of readings here to look at those actual origins of antitrust laws. That is, and regardless of their origins, as we see them applied, the question is whether they're applied in the public interest to protect consumers, or are they applied to protect less effective competitors from their more effective competition? And it seems pretty much uniformly the latter, right? That antitrust is a way of decreasing rather than ensuring that there's competition. And so if we take the Rothbardian view that there's no non-arbitrary way to define monopoly in a free market, then enforcement of antitrust law is going to necessarily be arbitrary. And this leads to a number of public choice issues that special interests will tend to dominate this process. And however, if we take a non-Rothbardian view, a mainstream view that sees monopoly everywhere, well, then it's like prosecutors say, like, show me the man and I'll show you the crime. Everything can be considered evidence of monopoly. Right? You might have heard this little joke before, right? If a firm's prices are too low, it's predatory pricing. Right? So predatory pricing being the idea, one dominant firm tries to sell at very low prices, much lower than their competitors, perhaps even at a loss, and then they drive their competitors out of business, and now they're the sole provider. They can raise their prices and make monopoly gains. But there's not any empirical evidence, at least not that I know of this really successfully happening. And why not? Well, even if you drive your competitors out of business by selling at a loss, and I mean, if you're a big competitor, that's more losses spread over more units. It's not like their capital goods disappear when they go bankrupt. They can just even go idle and watch you drive yourself into the ground. Though it's good for consumers, of course. If you're trying to charge these high prices that make you these, well, when I say monopoly gains, so to speak, not real monopoly gains, but that will attract further competition. Are you going to be able to make up for the losses you made over that short period where you're the sole provider before anyone else enters. Well, I guess I don't know of any evidence of it, but that's what predatory pricing is. So if your prices are too low, you're engaging in predatory behavior. If your prices are too high, well, that's price gouging, and that's also illegal. So what can you do? Well, if you charge the same prices as your competitors, that's collusion. So it seems like, it is, kind of a joke, but not really. There's an element of truth, and that's what makes it funny. And I want to illustrate this now. I'm trying to be as charitable as possible. So this is Lena Khan. She was FTC chair under the Biden administration, left last year. I want to focus on this paper she published in 2017 prior to becoming FTC chair. That was published in the Yale Law Journal, entitled Amazon's Antitrust Paradox. And here, I don't necessarily want to come off as just an apologist for Amazon. I'm saying they're just this perfect company. Rather, I want to critique the arguments she brings against Amazon. The paradox is basically, we can't really show how Amazon's hurting consumers, but we know we really want to regulate it. So we're going to find a reason to do so. And I hope you can forgive me from quoting a bit extensively from this paper. I found this portion interesting. It says, when pressed on why, critics often fumble to explain how a company that has so clearly delivered enormous benefits to consumers, not to mention revolutionized e-commerce in general, could at the end of the day threaten our markets. Trying to make sense of the contradiction, one journalist noted that the critics' argument seems to be that, quote, even though Amazon's activities tend to reduce book prices, which is considered good for consumers, they ultimately hurt consumers. So to resolve this paradox, she has to go about showing what it is that Amazon's doing that is actually hurting consumers. She doesn't really think that Amazon, or that it needs to be shown that Amazon's actually hurting consumers. She doesn't mention the Austrian School specifically. Most of her criticism is reserved for the Chicago School. But she presents this narrative as if antitrust law was moving along just fine throughout most of the 20th century. And then these Chicago School guys said, well, having large firms that seem dominant, like maybe they seem dominant because consumers actually like them. Maybe they're doing things well, and that's why they're big. So the focus of antitrust law should be on showing that consumers are hurt. And she doesn't like this standard. She said, well, no, she doesn't like focusing on consumer welfare. She wants to focus on economic structuralism, that whether there's many firms, whether firms are too big, whether they have too big a market share. And further, she doesn't want to show that consumers have been hurt because her argument is we need to be preemptive. Like once Amazon has this dominant position where they can really hurt consumers, then it'll be too late or much harder to fix. We need to do it before they do that. So she goes about trying to show this. Some other things she says that I find interesting is she says it is as if Bezos charted the company's growth by first drawing a map of antitrust laws and then devising routes to smoothly bypass them. With its missionary zeal for consumers, Amazon has marched toward monopoly by singing the tune of contemporary antitrust. So it's like, okay, Amazon understands what will trigger antitrust enforcement. They avoid that, and that makes that really suspicious. They're not blatantly violating antitrust law. So he gives some examples of what I find very frustrating about her paper is that there's a very inconsistent application where in some cases, if another company or group of companies is doing something, it's okay, but if Amazon's doing it, it's pretty bad. So let me give you this story. So she's critical of Amazon when they entered the ebook market. They're selling bestsellers at $9.99, quite a bit lower than what publishers were selling it for before. Publishers are worried that they're not going to be able to sell their hardcovers at much higher prices than $9.99. So like, oh, what do we do about this Amazon problem? So she notes that publishers, fearing that Amazon's $9.99 price point for ebooks would permanently drive down the price that consumers were willing to pay for all books, sought to wrest back some control. When the opportunity came to partner with Apple to sell ebooks through the iBook store, 5 of the big 6 publishers introduced agency pricing, whereby publishers would set the final retail price and Apple would get a 30% cut. After securing this deal, Macmillan, one of the big 6, demanded that Amazon too adopt this pricing model. Though it initially refused and delisted Macmillan's books, Amazon ultimately relented, explained to readers that, quote, "We will have to capitulate and accept Macmillan's terms because Macmillan has a monopoly over their own titles," end quote. Other publishers followed suit, halting Amazon's ability to price ebooks at $9.99. So, right, it seems like if anybody's engaging in collusion here, it's not Amazon. The publishers don't like that Amazon's charging such low prices. And I mean, to be fair, that's fine. Like, there's a role for pricing agreements. Wholesalers can say, well, we want you to price at this amount. And Amazon was free to refuse to take away Macmillan's books, and they ultimately decided that wasn't in their best interest. So to continue, it says in 2012, the Department of Justice sued the publishers and Apple's for colluding to raise ebook prices. In response to claims the DOJ was going after the wrong actor, given that it was Amazon's predatory tactics that drove the publishers and Apple to join forces, the DOJ investigated Amazon's pricing strategies and found persuasive evidence lacking to show the company had engaged in predatory practices. So it was, this effort at collusion by the big 6 publishers and Apple. That was this defense against Amazon. They weren't doing the bad thing, it was Amazon. Further argues about an argument she makes about Amazon, how it's navigating a way through avoiding antitrust enforcement, says they're engaged in predatory pricing, but not in that more traditional way we just talked about, where a company will lower prices and then raise the price of that good. She says, no, this is what they're doing with ebooks. She says they're taking their ebooks, they are selling them below cost to get people locked into Amazon's ecosystem and buying their Kindle. Then she says, once they do this, Amazon is positioned to recoup its losses by raising prices on less popular or obscure ebooks, or by raising prices on print books. In either case, Amazon would be recouping outside the original market where it sustained losses as bestseller ebooks, so courts are unlikely to look for or consider these scenarios. So it says, oh, well, they make up for these losses by cross-subsidizing them through print books or less popular obscure books. But then, it's bad when Amazon does it. She argues about the publishing industry, says the increasing cost of doing business with Amazon is upending the publisher's business model in ways that further risk sapping diversity. It says traditionally, publishing houses used a cross-subsidization model whereby they would use their bestsellers to subsidize weightier and riskier books, requiring greater upfront investment. So she's saying it's good when publishers do it, that if they cross-subsidize their less popular titles with their more popular titles, this increases diversity, even though this would be considered evidence of monopoly. So it's okay when book publishers do it, but it's bad when Amazon does it. So it just, I get frustrated with the inconsistency. I'm going to say some other points she makes. I find this one quite interesting. So, and this seems to be a big part of the basis of the FTC's ongoing case against Amazon, is what they do to, what Amazon's doing to Amazon marketplace sellers. So she notes that, this was, I believe in 2016, a manufacturer that had been selling an aluminum laptop stand on Marketplace for more than a decade saw a similar stand appear at half the price. The manufacturer learned the brand was Amazon Basics, the private line that Amazon had been developing since 2009. So it says the problem here is these sellers using Amazon Marketplace, Amazon then can see the sales data, know what people are buying, and then release their own version of it, an Amazon Basics version. And like, okay, again, how is this bad for consumers to give them more choices? See, this is what you get when you get away from this standard of whether consumers are hurt. And if the standard is then competitors are being hurt, then again, you're going to find that everywhere. Every competitive behavior is pretty much as necessarily will make competitors worse off. So lastly, move on from the subject of Lina Khan. So I had to give up. I felt like my brain was rotting a bit reading her paper. And I think this quote really sums up the feeling. She notes that large book retailer chains like Barnes & Noble have long used their market dominance to charge publishers for favorable product placement, such as displays in a storefront window or on a prominent table. That is, it's evidence that Barnes & Noble has this great monopoly power to ask publishers for money to put their books in more prominent locations. I guess if I'm an independent bookseller, it's like, I just got to do what those publishers tell me. I have no decision-making over where I display books. Just like, again, monopolies everywhere. And so the brain rot image that came to my mind was Lina Khan, or if Pepe Silva were Amazon violating antitrust law. She knows it's out there, and she's going to find it. But actually, most of it's a threat in the future. Like, okay, Amazon's selling all these things, apparently for a loss. They're not actually that profitable with their retail. Most of their profits come from other sources. So it's like, how are consumers hurt? Well, they're going to be hurt in the future once Amazon takes everything over. Okay. So moving on to case for repeal, as presented by Dominic Armentano. So here he has a more extended book, but if you're interested in looking at more on this subject, I'd highly recommend Antitrust, the Case for Repeal. It's, I'd say not quite a pamphlet, but can be read in 1 or 2 sittings, in which he talks about cases for all these different antitrust enforcement actions regarding product differentiation, capital intensity, efficiency, and innovation, that there are legitimate reasons to do these things that aren't just to screw over consumers, right? If a product differentiation might seem like a bad thing to a neoclassical economist who wants to dictate or has opinions about what people should like. Like, I guess Bernie Sanders and his problem with too many deodorants comes to mind. But there's not, you really have to substitute your own preferences over what consumers demonstrate what they prefer, right? It might be, say for a car manufacturer, if they decide they want to update models every year, yes, this takes more resources than not updating your models every year. But if consumers are willing to pay sufficiently, they're demonstrating, yes, we like that allocation of resources. So there's not really any this non-imperial way to say this is a waste of resources if consumers are demonstrating that they value that. I want to, just to point out a case that I find quite amusing regarding efficiency and innovation. In fact, being a barrier to entry. There was this case involving the Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa. This is in the late 1930s. Judge Learned Hand, he decided that Alcoa being very efficient and serving consumers well, this was not a defense against engaging in, accusations of engaging in anti-competitive behavior. So I just want to quote from him for you. It says, "It was not inevitable that Alcoa, should always anticipate increases in the demand for ingot and be prepared to supply them. Nothing compelled it to keep doubling and redoubling its capacity before others entered the field. It insists that it never excluded competitors, but we can think of no more effective exclusion than progressively to embrace each new opportunity as it opened, and to face every newcomer with new capacity already geared into a great organization, having the advantage of expertise, trade connections, and the elite of personnel." So what got Alcoa in trouble was just serving customers so well and anticipating their wants so perfectly. Not to belabor the point, I guess I got a few minutes left. To give you some other examples of some chicanery that antitrust enforcement can involve with horizontal mergers. Right, if taking the Austrian view, right, where market share is not relevant to whether competition exists or does not exist, there's no scientific way to determine at this percentage of market share, this now becomes unacceptable, and the FTC or DOJ should decrease market power. And this also gets back to the difficulties of definition 1 of monopoly, where depending on how narrowly we define a product, we can say, oh, you really have a big market share. An example of this occurred in the late 90s, where the FTC opposed a proposed merger between Staples and Office Depot, the big box office supply stores. They said this would allegedly result in a 75% market share, and Office Max would be their only competitor. Of course, this is if you consider the market to be these big office supply stores, right? Not just people who happen to sell office supplies, right? If you included all those, economists estimate that you include Walmart, Best Buy, and the thousands of independently owned office supply stores, their combined market share would be something more like 5%. Right? They'd only do this, they'd only merge if they considered this to make them more competitive, to offer consumers a better deal. And that's basically the reason regarding all of these actions. Businesses are doing this because they think this will make them more effective competitors. And it's up to consumers to decide in the competitive market process, like, do they actually serve consumers better? If they don't, well then, consumers won't patronize them. Okay, so to summarize, competition is a process of rivalry among entrepreneurs who are free to compete as they see fit within a given legal framework of property rights and contract. And this can include few firms or many firms. It can include small firms and big firms, but it'll ultimately be decided by profit and loss. This is consumers indicating whether they consider resources being allocated to more highly valued uses or less valued uses. This will involve entry, exit, growth, innovation, experimentation. And so the role of government in this is to not grant monopoly privileges. Right? That was a disappointing thing of Lena Kahn's paper. She doesn't at all consider what currently existing laws might advantage Amazon. And it was pre-COVID when she published it, but if the government implements laws that close brick and mortar stores, these kinds of things will benefit Amazon at the expense of their competitors. And so since FTC chairs or other officials enforcing antitrust don't have access to some special knowledge of what consumers want better than consumers themselves, their efforts at antitrust won't improve consumer welfare, or at least it definitely can't be demonstrated scientifically. So the best government policy is to not grant monopoly privileges and remove the ones that exist. So with that, I'll end, and thank you for your attention. I've applied there. I used to be okay. And he was talking about like he's like commercially
What's that? Actually have time, but I don't. All right.
I mean, he's probably he'd want to compete on that margin of being in general.
Okay, please find your seats. Thank you. Okay, I've deliberately chosen this color and this format, including a star, because the commies like Mayor Mamdani in New York City have instituted a rent freeze starting in October. Apartments, 1 and 2 year leases, when they run out, the rent cannot be raised. So for many years, since the 1970s, actually since World War II, New York City has had rent controls. But generally, there's been what's called partial vacancy decontrol, where when a tenant leaves the building, gives up his apartment, the landlord is permitted to raise the rent towards the market equilibrium rent by 10% or 15%. But Mamdani has gotten rid of that, and so the new rule that's going to, or regulation that's going to go into effect in October of this year is that the rents are completely frozen. Okay. And this is the price controls are the quintessential intervention, and they really are the road to socialism, which is what these people, these social democrats really want, and really not. Social democrats is just another way of spelling communists. So what is a price control? It's a type of a government intervention. And we know that laws and regulations, that government interventions are laws and regulations that seek to change market outcomes. They want to change the price of the good. They want to change the quantity produced of a good, possibly. They want to change the identity of the seller. They want you to only buy maybe from monopolists. They want to change the value of money. All of this, to some extent, they can succeed in some of these things, but it brings with it many different long-run implications. That is what economics is all about, teaching you about the long-run consequences of various government policies. So for Rothbard, then, there's a couple of different kinds of intervention. I want to place price controls among that. There's something called autistic intervention, which is when the state directly commands you to do something, to give a salute to a dictator, to have a particular type of religious observance. It really doesn't affect the market that much. Binary intervention does affect the market directly. So that's a coercive exchange where the government forces you to pay taxes and take in return its lousy public schooling and police protection and so on. So there is an exchange. It's an intervention involves just two people, the intervener, the government, and the citizen or subject who pays the tax. And monetary inflation is really a binary intervention, because when the government prints new money, it surreptitiously seizes resources from you, okay? So each individual is confronted by this government caused inflation. The second kind is triangular intervention. This is where price controls come in. It's a coercive interference in the exchange between two subjects. It either sets the rate of exchange between two products, that is money and rents, or rents and apartment units, or milk and money. In other words, there's three people involved, three actors involved: the government, which is the intervener, and then the two subjects, the buyer and the seller. Okay, they cannot agree voluntarily to any given price. They have to obey the price controls. What is a price control? Well, we have a couple of them. It's, as I said, it's a triangular intervention, okay, and it forcibly changes the price voluntarily agreed upon by the buyer and the seller. There's a price ceiling, which is a legal maximum on the price of a good or service, okay? An example, which I'll go through, is rent control. And it's a price floor, like a minimum wage, in which no one can accept less than a certain amount for their service or good. So let's look at the general effects of price controls. They distort entrepreneurial profit calculations and production decisions because the prices are suddenly changed from their market equilibrium levels, from the actual market prices. So that does affect prices, profits, okay? It lowers prices in relation to costs of production, and therefore it causes resources to move, labor and capital, to move to areas that are lower, have lower value. So it diverts scarce resources from more valuable uses to the less valuable uses in the economy. Okay. And because all prices are interconnected, it causes disorder. It causes what Rothbard calls calculational chaos. Okay. We have, as we'll see in the case of post-war Germany that was occupied by the US and the French and the British, who maintained Hitler's price controls, things were being, there was a dire need for medicine, a dire need for shelter, to repair buildings, but because of price controls, it wasn't profitable to do these things. So instead, people were buying perfumes, costume jewelry, toys. These are things that Hitler didn't think to put price controls on. So labor and capital moved into these much lower valued areas. And this encourages, as we'll see in a moment, a movement towards central planning and socialism. Okay. So let's use the example, Mises' classic example, and I recommend everyone read this, of a price ceiling on milk. Okay, so he says, well, you know, the government wants to make milk more plentiful, more abundant, and cheaper for lower income groups. So the price controllers or the government gets the idea to just pass a law that says you can't sell milk at above a certain price. But we know what happens then, okay? Suddenly, you have the distortion of prices and monetary calculation, and you have now much lower profits or even losses in the production of milk. And as a result, you also have a lower price, so the quantity demanded is increased. So you have a shortage. You have production falling because of the lower profits, but you have quantity demanded increasing because it's now cheaper to purchase milk. So the government fails in the first step in achieving its end of making milk more plentiful and cheaper. It does make it cheaper, but it makes it less plentiful, and there's a shortage. And so for some people, the people that can't get any milk, they have to wait hour at the end of the line, it makes the price of milk not lower, but infinite. If you can't get any, price is in effect infinite. So what happens to the labor and capital? Well, it moves from milk, which now is, you lose money or you get very small profits from producing it, to shifting the fresh milk into butter, cheese, and beef, okay? That is slaughtering the cows that were giving milk and using it for beef. But that's lower valued uses to the consumers, okay? Now you have an underproduction of milk, a shortage, and an overproduction of these lower valued goods. They're lower value not because they're inherently less valuable than milk, but because there's now too much of them in relation to how much milk there is. So the government sees this movement of labor and capital, and it, of course, the idiot price controllers say, well, you know what? We'll put price controls on butter, meat, and cheese, and force labor and capital back into the production of milk. We'll force the farmers in some sense, because now they can't make as much profit producing these other things. But of course, that just causes a shortage and lower production of butter and cheese and meat and so on. Okay, so then they come up with the bright idea of, well, let's lower the cost of production. If we lower the cost of production of milk, of butter, of cheese, and so on, we will get people then to we will reestablish their profit margins, and the movement will be reversed. But of course, then what happens? They put these price controls on grain and farm labor. They try to lower the wages and the prices because these are the costs of the input. They're trying to lower the costs so the profits reappear. But what happens? People leave the farms. Labor goes into factories. Less grain is grown, and less corn is grown, less wheat is grown. Quantity demanded of these things increase. So now you have a shortage of all of these things. You have shortages in lower production of wheat, corn, and the supply of farm labor because they move into the cities and into the factories where there's still profits, there's still higher wages. So then, of course, now you see what's happening. We're going towards full socialism. You put price controls on factory products and factory labor, the necessities that are being produced, clothing and medicine and so on. But you leave, as Hitler did, the trivial items uncontrolled, but there's still profits in those items, even though they're trivial. So then you have labor and capital moving into items like liquor and toys and jewelry and so on, okay? And now you have a shortage of clothing, shoes, and other necessities. So that's the last step. The last step, of course, is all around price controls, which is another way of introducing socialism, okay? So Mises goes through this, and he lived through this. So it's very interesting to read. It's in his book on intervention. I'm not sure the exact title of the book. Critique of Interventionism. It's in that book, okay? Let me give you another example. So the Allies, in order to cripple the German industrial economy after they conquered Germany, the French, the British, and the Americans, and the Russians decided to maintain Hitler's price controls, which were put in place in 1936. So by 1948, there had been 12 years of price controls. There were dire shortages of food, medicine, clothing, and shelter. People were literally starving in the streets. But yet, there were toy sellers, people selling costume jewelry, perfume, makeup, and that's what was being produced, these lower valued items, this flood of these lower valued items instead of these necessities. So the Minister of Finance, Ludwig Erhard, who was a follower of what was called the ordo-liberal school of economists, who were classical liberals for the most part, and they took their inspiration from Mises. Erhard realized that, look, I can make this problem go away almost instantly by repealing the price controls and the production controls that the Allies had insisted on. So he talked to General Lucius Clay, who was the governor of the American sector of the occupation, and he told him about his idea. Clay didn't want to hear about it, said it was stupid and dangerous and so on. So on June 20th, Sunday, when Clay was playing golf, Ludwig Erhard issued an order to repeal all price controls immediately, and as well as to free the foreign exchanges and other things. So he abolished them. And there were reports, I don't know how truthful they are, that on June 21st, on that Monday, the shops were full of goods. Not because many people had just been hoarding these goods. Many of the sellers didn't want to sell them because it just wasn't profitable to. So that's when the German miracle started. And there was an interesting exchange. And again, I don't know how true this is, but one economist reports that it was true. General Clay said to Erhard in a phone call, Erhard, Mr. Erhard in German, "My advisors tell me what you have done is a terrible mistake," unquote. Erhard responds, "Herr General, pay no attention to them. My advisors tell me the same thing." So because his advisors were social democrats. And the American economists that were there and advising the German government also said it was a horrendous mistake. People like Walter Heller, who later became Kennedy's chief head chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. So there were a lot of Keynesian economists were involved in the war, and they were involved in the war economy. So they had a bias toward these types of controls. Okay. So I want to do a case study in rent controls, which is very interesting because there are a lot of long-run effects of rent controls that you never really think of, that you think are just exogenous shocks to the economy, that things that just happen. But in fact, you can tie them all back to rent controls, as I'll show you. Okay, so let's look at a graph showing what rent controls do. So if you have a free market in apartment units, in rental units, you have the following. You have a rental price, you have the quantity of apartments on the horizontal axis, and there's a demand for apartments, and the quantity demand that increases as the price falls, as you can see, so it's downward sloping. And also there's a supply of apartments. The supply curve slopes upward and to the right because as prices go up, profits are higher and more buildings are built, if that's a long run supply curve. But even if it's in the very short run, as prices as rents go up, people will begin renting rooms or refurbishing basements and renting them out. So you get almost an immediate response to an increase in rents. So let's say this small city has an equilibrium rent of $1,800, and at that rent, buyers and sellers trade 3,000 apartment units, okay? And the rent is per month, $1,800 per month. But what happens if that city happens to have rent controls and have had them in place for a long time so that the costs of running a building, the taxes, utilities, the repair costs, the doorman, let's say all those costs are going up. Well, then you're stuck with being able to charge only $1,000 rent, and yet the equilibrium rent's $1,800. So two things happen, of course. On the one hand, so it's illegal to charge more than $1,000 in rent. On the one hand, you have people wanting to rent more units in that apartment. People from the suburbs who work in the city would rather rent in the city to be closer to their jobs. So the apartment demand for apartments, quantity demanded, goes from 3,000, which was the equilibrium, to 4,000. So you have 1,000 more. But on the other hand, some people will cut back on the apartments that they're renting, and that falls to 2,500. So voila, you have a shortage of apartments, okay, 1,500 apartments. There are 1,500 people out there that are frustrated, can't find apartments, and there's a lot of implications of the fact that you have these people who are desperate for apartments or housing near their jobs and so on, or near their families. So we say that this ceiling is a binding constraint because it prevents the full volume of exchanges that you would get if you had an equilibrium rent. All right. Oops. Okay, so let me just give you some ideas about what occurs when you have these rent controls. So of course you have a shortage of rental housing, as I've shown there. But the shortage grows much larger over time because it discourages the construction of buildings, of new apartment buildings. Whereas if you allowed the rents to increase, there'd be more apartment buildings there'd be an increase in supply of apartment buildings, that supply curve would shift to the right and rents would come down naturally, okay? And also, the supply curve actually becomes less and less for another reason. People begin to, if condominiums and cooperatives, which are apartment buildings which sell the units to owners, if that's not controlled, then it's usually not controlled, then they take the rental units, the apartment units off the market, and they sell them to the tenants or to anybody who wants to buy them. And that lowers the supply even more, makes the shortage even greater, and that causes a waiting list of people who want to get apartments in this city. And of course, landlords by law can't raise their rent, but they can lower their costs. And the way to lower costs is to cut back on the maintenance of the buildings. And that doesn't hurt people in middle income and upper income buildings as much. They may fire the doorman or have them on only part-time. They may recarpet and repaint the common areas every 3 years instead of every 2 years. There's ways to cut back on an upper income or middle income apartment without making it unlivable. But now if you live in a lower income apartment, what happens? They stop repairing it. So if the light goes out in the hallway, or if the elevator breaks down, or if the lock breaks on the outer door, they don't fix it. They cut back on their maintenance crews, or they fix it after a great delay, and the buildings become more insecure to live in, okay? Less safe to live in. And with the darkness in the hallways, when the lights go out, you have junkies congregating and shooting up and so on and so forth. So things become hellish. Now, did the government intend that? No, but because they can't reason, as an economist would, they don't realize that. They blame it on other things, other factors, on greedy landlords not replacing the bulbs. So they put more controls on the landlords, makes it more costly to maintain the building. Okay. And then something else happens, very strange. Tenant mobility is frozen. So no one wants to give up an apartment in a rent-controlled city because you'll be on a waiting list to find another apartment. So if you're a large family, let's say you have, let's see what example I give here. So you have 3 kids and you live in a 2-bedroom apartment and you want a bigger apartment. There's a natural mobility that occurs in big cities. People are moving every 5 or 10 years into bigger apartments, and people whose children have grown and moved away or whose spouse has passed away, they move into the smaller apartments that are vacated. So that's a natural market-driven mobility. That's frozen. So you have a widow whose children have moved out, grown and moved out, living in a 3-bedroom apartment, and you have a family of 5, as I mentioned, living in a 2-bedroom apartment. So space is radically misallocated, okay? More interestingly, young couples begin to either postpone their weddings or plan their weddings around their place on the waiting lists, because it's that, or you got to live with the in-laws. I mean, that's rough. But there's repercussions into every corner of life when you have these rent controls. Also, a black market grows up. So what happens is that people start bribing, not the owners, because the owners are never really there, it's just their managers or the superintendents of the building. They begin bribing the superintendents to be pushed up on the waiting list. Also, existing tenants benefit tremendously because during periods of rent controls, what some tenants do is to rent more than one apartment, get on a lot of waiting lists, and then they sublet the apartments illegally at rents that are much higher than the controlled rents. But that doesn't help additional building because these tenants don't need an incentive. They're not going to build new apartment buildings. If that money went to the owner directly, you would have an incentive to build more apartment buildings, and there wouldn't be a shortage to begin with, but rents would begin to fall naturally. Okay. Okay. Another thing that happens, you suddenly see an uptick in racism, religious discrimination, sexual discrimination in the renting of apartments. Now, why would that be? Well, because if you were discriminating or engaging in certain preferences, let's say you have a lecherous landlord who only wants to rent to females between 18 and 25, okay? That person would run on a free market, let's say where the rent of an apartment is $2,000, that person would run into the problem of having a lot of vacancies. It's very hard to find his targeted audience or his target tenant group that he wants to move in. So instead of having 1 or 2 apartments vacant, he would have maybe 10 apartments in his building vacant. And at $2,000 each, that's $20,000 he's giving up per month to engage in those preferences. And the same thing with people who discriminate. If they only want redheads, as Murray Rothbard always uses as an example, or they discriminate against redheads, that would cut down on the pool of tenants that would be tenants, and as a result, you would have more vacancies. And there's the opportunity cost of not renting those apartments out means that you're losing the income from those apartments. So even social problems like racism and so on, are exacerbated by rent controls. Something else that happened, and I experienced this firsthand, landlords no longer need to compete for tenants, right? Because there's a waiting list. They have all tenants that they can handle. Tenants are bribing superintendents to get into the building, so you don't have to compete. So then you can do something nefarious, which is, if you read the small print on your lease, okay, at least in the Northeast where I grew up, you can hardly do anything but stand in the middle of your apartment and breathe. And the reason for that, they have all of these things in fine print that you're not permitted to do, is to protect the existing tenants from unruly tenants, tenants that are rude or noisy. And so they would only impose those things to get an unruly tenant out of the building. Okay, but once there's no opportunity cost, you don't care who leaves because there's a waiting list, then you'll begin imposing them. So for example, and I was looking at lease that I had signed in the past, there were no pets, no unrelated overnight guests, no parties after 10 p.m., no washing of vehicles in the parking lot, and it went on and on. But as I said, these things weren't imposed in the normal situation where there's no rent controls. They're only imposed under rent controls because the landlords can get away with it. And it becomes much more difficult for people with children or pets to find apartments because both pets and children are noisy and they destroy things. So landlords really discriminate against those groups, okay? So I ran into this problem when I used to live I teach at a college in southern New Jersey near Atlantic City. And there were no rent controls or anything like that. And there was no, in the lease it said you couldn't have pets, but everybody had cats. Not many people had dogs, but people had cats, and nobody ever sent you a letter of eviction or anything like that. People washed their cars in the parking lots and did all of those types of things. So when I moved into an apartment, when I changed jobs, and I moved into an apartment in northern New Jersey, which under the influence of New York City had some rent controls, things changed. I had a cat, and a neighbor came over and said, "You better hide that cat." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because, we're not allowed to have them." I said, "So?" Because I figured, the landlord doesn't care. If you have a cat, they're not dirty animals and so on. She said, no, it turns out there was a gang of Gestapo preteen kids that the manager hired to go and look into people's windows to see who had cats. I mean, so it was a very rigorous enforcement. Oh, and I also noticed at night that people were out there with flashlights in the parking lot looking, and they're washing their cars or they're walking their dogs, at midnight. So crazy things like that happen. Again, who would have thought that this is an effect of rent controls? And partial vacancy decontrol actually make things worse. So if the town says, all right, if you get some, when the existing tenant moves out, we'll allow you to raise the rent to the new tenant by 10% or 15% or something like that. But then what does that do to the landlord? So instead of not fixing the boiler on, or the heater on a cold winter's night, he's up there trying to sabotage. He's in the basement trying to sabotage the heater. He wants people out so he can get the higher rents, 10%, 15%. I personally know of someone who allowed a band, who owned the building, and allowed a rock band to practice at 10 o'clock in a vacant apartment to drive the tenants out. And rent controls can cause really bizarre and ghoulish behavior. There's a famous example in Paris, France, in the years immediately after World War II. So by the end of the war, rents for an average apartment in Paris had been controlled from 1914. So by 1948, so the rents hadn't it was a rent freeze. So rents hadn't changed since 1914, and now it's 1948. And there had been massive inflations during World War I and World War II in France. Rents were equivalent to $1.50 to $2.50 per month, which was equivalent to about 6 to 11 packs of cigarettes. Okay, so rents were almost nothing, okay? So of course, there was a massive shortage in France. Now, this really impacted the soldiers who were coming back and had postponed marriages and so on. So younger couples, either, whether they were engaged or were just married, while the husband or the male worked, the wife would, right after breakfast, find a park where older people congregated to sun themselves, to socialize, and so on. She'd then look around and try to detect the sickliest older person. She would then wait until that person went back to their home, follow them, go to the superintendent, and pay a bribe to be the first one told of that person's death. So they could move, and then you just move your furniture right in. Some of the people cut out the middleman. They bribed morticians to let them know the address of the next person that came in. Okay, that's how desperate that they were. Oh, finally, so as taxes and costs of utilities continue to rise while the rents are frozen, profits margins become negative, and landlords begin to abandon their buildings and forfeit them to the city. And New York City and any city is the worst landlord you can have. So even at a free rent, tenants just abandon their apartments because all the services disappear. You got to walk up 6 flights of stairs because the elevators don't work and the city's not repairing them. And I have an interesting article by someone. It was written in 1972, but it's called "I Was a Slumlord." Where are we here? Okay. So this is by a guy named George Frank, and he writes as follows. It's a very short article. He says, I was a slumlord. I was born 69 years ago. He came from Hungary and so on. He says, about 20 years ago, so in 1952, and the information's up there as I'm reading, I bought a small factory building in East Harlem, okay, in a certain street. He had a workshop with 10 to 12 men. He made cabinets. With changes, improvements, and additional construction, the factory cost me about $65,000. Then a few years later, he bought a building next door, which was a 4-family house. and he bought it for $12,500. And the four families living there were all middle-class families, and they all worked and so on. He says, for several years now, my cash expenses have exceeded my income by about 25%. So he's losing money out of pocket, not even including paying off the mortgage. The building was in poor repair when I bought it. By now, it is the favorite hunting ground of every city inspector. I need about $15,000 worth of repairs. The building now has a gross income of $2,600, of which I am paying for taxes and heat about $3,000. So he's making $2,600 a month. He's paying $3,000 because of these rent controls. So why didn't he go to the city and apply for hardship? You can get rents raised if you can show hardship. He said that the fee to the lawyer would have taken away any increase that he got. And he says, so far I've been fined 4 times for failure to comply with orders to correct building code violations. I was summoned to court again only a few weeks ago, and I explained my predicament. The judge assured me of his sympathy, fined me $40, and promised that my next fine would be higher. So he says, I did not go home from the court. I went straight to the offices of the local Roman Catholic Church and asked them to accept the building as a free gift, because now it's garbage. It's costing him money to keep it. They didn't. Catholics aren't stupid. An hour later, I made the same offer to the Protestants. Again, the answer was no. Next, I offered the building free without any money to the 4 tenants. They didn't want it. So I'll abandon the building was my next thought. You can't abandon the building, though. You're legally liable for it, okay, once you own it, unless the title passes legally. So here I am with a building assessed by the city at $21,000. I repeat, $21,000, that I cannot give away, I cannot sell, and I cannot abandon. So they claim the building's worth $21,000, but the price on the market is negative, okay? He says he finally sold it for $30,000, but as an extra inducement, he threw into the bargain his factory building, which cost him close to $70,000. He threw it into the bargain for nothing. So he gave his factory building away, which was, could be used. There's no rent controls on commercial activity and so on. So he gave that away just to get rid of the house. Okay, so that's another effect of rent control. And now let's look at a famous quote by a Swedish economist, who was a social democrat, by the way, but even he saw the horrors of rent control. He says, in many cases, rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing. So let me go through and let me make sure I have the correct answers here. It's hard to tell which cities were bombed and which had rent controls. Okay, I got I have to know I have the answers here because I'm not sure which is which. Okay, was that city bombed or was that from rent controls? Rent control, the Bronx, New York City, okay? Because once people abandon the building, squatters move in, arsonists burn them down, or the junkies use them, and eventually, they're not repaired at all, so they just collapse, crumble. What about that? That's bomb damage. That's Hiroshima. Okay, what about number 4? That's Nagasaki. That's bombing again, okay? That's not bombing. That's rent controls. That's the Bronx. I used to pass by that when I was going out with my wife. She lived in Long Island. I lived in New Jersey. I had to go through the Bronx road. It was on a highway, fortunately, but I would see these. It was amazing to see it. That is the South Bronx. It's even worse than the regular Bronx. Okay, so that was rent control. Okay, what about that one? That's bomb damage. Okay, that's Nagasaki. What is that? Anybody? Rent control. That's the South Bronx. Okay. So even socialist economists realize the problems with rent controls. Okay. I was going to talk a little bit about the Oregon market, but I don't have enough time. So I'll stop here. And I guess we have 7 minutes for questions.
Questions? All right. Just by the way, keep your questions short, and I will hold the
And make sure
microphone.
there's a question mark at the end.
Yes.
Not just a...
All right, I'll hold the mic.
Thank you. My question is, what's your prediction for Mamdani's rent control? Would it be questioning whether or not it's rent controlled or bombed, those houses?
I mean, they've rebuilt, there's houses where these rent controls were now because they loosened them up so much, or they were sold off the land for housing. So things are a lot better now, the way they look in New York City. And it'll take a number of years because this took from World War II to, things started to fall apart in maybe the 60s, early 70s. So it will take a number of years for it to look anything like that. But the immediate effects will begin to occur. There'll be shortages and all new construction will stop, certainly of middle income and lower income buildings and so on.
Dr. Salerno, would you say that theoretically bomb damage might actually be worse than rent control? Economically, not
In what sense?
ethically.
Okay, what's that?
Because if a city gets bombed, but there's no rent control, theoretically they could always rebuild. They could rebuild all the damage.
In that sense, yeah, if rent controls are still on, there'll be no incentive to rebuild. Whereas with Germany, when they took the rent controls off, they rebuilt cities, I mean, in amazingly short times. That's a good point.
Dr. Salerno, a question. So obviously there's a lot of, worrying about Mamdani specifically, but do you think he's like anything uniquely bad when it comes to rent control policies or rent freezes, or is he just kind of like the continuation of the status quo in New York City?
Well, I don't know of any place that recently that has completely frozen rents, where he's gotten rid of vacancy decontrol completely. So yeah, I think he's worse by a half.
What do you believe to be some of the most, or maybe the most infamous example of surpluses as a result of price floors?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, there's 15 million eggs in, there was minimum price control on agricultural products in the United States and Canada in the 60s and 70s. And so farmers weren't allowed to sell below a certain price, which of course caused a surplus, the opposite of a shortage. And so there were like 15 million eggs were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of pigs were slaughtered because they weren't, you couldn't sell them on the market. In the United States, it was massive. We have a massive surplus of wheat because they kept a floor on wheat that was far above the world level. So what happened was they began to use mothballed World War II ships to store the wheat. There was so much of it, there were not enough silos to hold the wheat. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it was good. It was good back in the 90s and 80s when you were closer to this to teach about these things because they were still kind of like going on. We don't hear much about them now. Thank you. You're welcome.
What would your recommended course of action be for a business owner or capital owner encountering price controls interfering with their...
Get out. No, really. And they're doing that. People are leaving the city. They're streaming out of New York, the city. I come from the Northeast, you can tell. The city is New York City. They're leaving the city.
What would be the best way to incentivize building more houses since rent control is not ideal in today's age?
The best way is, I mean, look, you could, I would say the free market. I mean, that's a kind of a glib answer. I would say, when I was in Houston in 1986, giving lectures, there had been an oil bust, and the prices of oil had gone down, and people were moving out of Houston, and the landlords in Houston were giving away 6 months free rent. They were giving away toaster ovens. That's when they were first coming. And so you want competition. I mean, rents will fall just as well as they'll rise. Okay, last question.
Oh, I have a very short question. So, it tends to be almost common knowledge, I think, that these price controls are very, very bad. Like, why do people like Mamdani still engage in it? How is it politically profitable to just destroy the housing supply even further?
I'll tell you the rent control story real quick. Rent controls benefited people who owned luxury apartments, or people who were in luxury apartments, because those rents were fixed and didn't go up, but the buildings didn't change that much. So the head of NBC was living in a building that was like a whole square block, and he was like, I don't know, let's say it was $100,000 a month, and he was paying $40,000 a month. So the richer people and some middle class people, they vote for rent controls because they're the ones that benefit, and the poor think that they're going to benefit because the rents look low, and so they may vote for it, but they're the ones that are hurt. It's the lower income people that are hurt. And who gives money to campaigns? Rich people. So in New York City, the elites were in favor of rent controls and a lot of the middle class. Okay, thank you.
Looks like it's about 4 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get rolling. Right, so my topic this afternoon is tariffs versus free trade. Right, so this is a case where I'm going to have to debate myself, I suppose, which is always a bad position to be in because I'm guaranteed to lose. But here we are. It's also kind of an odd topic for me as an economist to talk about, not because it's a strange topic, but in many ways I kind of feel like the geographer debating people from the Flat Earth Society. Right? And it is a topic that amongst economists we seem to have something like agreement for 200 years. Right? Nonetheless, the rest of the public is not caught up. And you see that, of course, in the political sphere. Right? So certainly famously here in the United States at the moment, we have an administration that isn't particularly interested in free trade. And even those factions within the Trump administration that are somewhat more favorable toward free trade, at least as some kind of ideal. I think about people like Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent seems at least somewhat favorable to this as being a nice thing we could aim for. But even amongst these people, it seems like for them, getting to free trade is rather like getting to heaven. Like, we want to get there, but not yet. Right? So it's certainly a relevant topic and one where we're going to have to revisit arguments that have been made for the past couple centuries. Right? So as we get into this, let's start with some definitions. Right? So when I say free trade, what do I mean by free trade? Right? So what we're talking about here is allowing the purchase and the sale of goods across national borders without any imposition of policy barriers. So we'll not have taxes that are specifically placed on goods that are crossing borders in either direction. We'll not be placing quotas or limitations on the number of goods that may pass across borders. I'm specifically going to look at the violation of free trade that is tariffs because that's the title of the talk. Right, so what is a tariff? Right, so a tariff would be a tax that is placed on either exports or imports. Right? Now, the reality is that in the modern world, most wealthy countries don't use export tariffs. There's very, very few, wealthy countries like the US would use export tariffs. The US doesn't use export tariffs in part because it's constitutionally forbidden. Whether that matters is a fair question, but it is in fact in the Constitution. The US cannot have export tariffs. So I'm mostly going to focus on import tariffs. But before we get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about the middle and lower income countries that do sometimes use export tariffs and say kind of why it is that they may do this. So typically, when we look at these countries that do use export tariffs, it seems like what they're trying to do is a combination of mostly two things. Right? One would be that they place export tariffs on things like raw materials. Right? So we want to make sure that whatever the raw materials are we produce here at home, do not go abroad. We want to try to encourage manufacturing here by keeping iron very cheap, so that would encourage our manufacturing. The second would be agricultural goods. It's very common to find agricultural goods have export tariffs, again, trying to discourage things like food products from leaving, so then you're making food cheap, for people here at home. And so all of these are an attempt to satisfy domestic agricultural consumers and to satisfy domestic industry. And so that's the attempt here. Now, I also want to make another observation, again, before we get too much into the deep analysis, is just one of the basic questions I want to get out of the way as quickly as possible is, well, just to preview coming attractions, tariffs are not that great. Right? Well, if tariffs are not that great, why do so many countries use them? Right? Well, one observation we can make is, again, when you look at different levels of income in countries, the wealthier countries tend not to have very high tariff rates, tend to have fairly low tariff rates. It's mostly those relatively lower income countries that have higher rates of tariffs. So why might they do this? Well, I think that there is perhaps just a practical concern here. Well, if I want to fund my government, I need to have some kind of tax revenue. Now, in a relatively poor country, what we tend to see is that there are large informal economies where it's very difficult to track things like individual income. It's very difficult to track things like individual sales right within the border of our country. Right? So that makes it very difficult then to implement anything like a sales tax, right? Or an income tax. If we don't have very good records of who owns what land, we can't really implement a land tax or property tax. What is easy to implement, though, is to watch what goods are going in or coming out of each port, right? Tax those things, and then practically this is a way that you can raise money. Right? So those in authority in these lower income countries, that is kind of the option that is available, right, to them. So I actually kind of wonder at how much it's a devotion to the idea of tariffs amongst these countries versus just a desire to tax what they can actually practically tax. All right, so those introductory remarks out of the way, I want to start, start 5 minutes in, with building up the case for free trade. Because I think we need to start with that, or let's talk about how things go right before they can go wrong. So I want to start then, in the case for free trade, with a bad argument for free trade. We need to know what the wrong way sign is, right? So and the bad argument for free trade goes something like this. It's a reductio ad absurdum. It's something like this. Well, if countries shouldn't import from other countries, right, so we want to put all these trade restrictions in place, well, doesn't that imply then, right, that, say, Alabama should not trade with Georgia, should not trade with Florida? It doesn't imply that Auburn should not trade with Opelika. It doesn't imply that Engelhardt should not trade with Swig or Terrell, right, that each of us individually should just produce everything we need for our own consumption and that we'd be better off then. Obviously, we know this is not the case, right, because if you left me to myself to produce everything that I need, I would very quickly be in rags and starving. Like, I have a garden. I would have to eat quite a bit of lettuce, and then I would rapidly die after that. So okay, obviously we don't want to do this, right? Therefore, free trade is good. So what are the issues with this argument? Because to some degree, certainly to those that are favorable toward free trade, this feels like it would be a reasonable argument. So what's the issue? Well, the first is that very few people that are opposed to true free trade, very few people advocating for tariffs, are actually saying that we shouldn't trade at all. That's not the argument being made. Right? So we're answering an argument that is not being made. So that in itself is going to make it unconvincing. And so normally the argument against free trade is not no trade, it's some restrictions on trade, which is a very different thing. Another point that I would make about it is just kind of a rhetorical point, right? And that is, we end up, this is the argument you make, your conclusion is, right, that free trade is good because tariffs, restrictions, whatever, are awful. Right? Well, that's not necessarily true. Right? Sometimes the options are all awful. So if the options are all awful, and you say, well, this one's awful, that doesn't prove the other one isn't awful. I will sometimes, when I work through kind of cases in class, trying to prove various things with my students, I'll warn people about the temptation of the multiple choice test and the way that it encourages us to think. Right? So I give the example, say, suppose someday I come in and I have 3 large cardboard boxes that I've placed at the front of the room. And I tell you there's a unicorn in one of these boxes. And I reveal, right, in box number 1, there is no unicorn. In box number 2, there is no unicorn. Is the rational conclusion that the 3rd box contains a unicorn? No, unicorns aren't real. None of the boxes contain a unicorn. I was just lying, right? That's another option, right? So we don't want to get trapped into the multiple choice test thinking, right? So, oh, well, if tariffs are bad, it must be, right, that free trade is good. Now, so I want to build instead a positive case for free trade. I'd also note that this idea that tariffs are bad, therefore free trade is good, tends not to make people enthusiastic either. Like, well, at least it's not the worst thing. No, we want to see that the thing we're aiming for is actually good and worthwhile. Right, so I'm going to echo now some remarks that were made yesterday, some of them coming from Dr. Herbner, some from Dr. Rittenauer, but I think that they're worth repeating. Herbner and Rittenauer are basically always worth repeating. So I think the first argument for why free trade is in fact beneficial. So suppose that we have 2 people. One of them I'm going to name Lou, the other one I'm going to name Ming. And Ming has a toy doll that she would like to sell. And she's willing to exchange, right, this doll for money. Lou is interested in buying a doll, has some money available, right, and would be very happy to exchange that money for the doll. And so the two of them meet, right, they negotiate a price that both of them find acceptable, and they engage in this exchange. Right, so Ming walks away happy having received the money that she wished and giving up the doll that she preferred less, and Lou walks away happy having given up a reasonable amount of money and walking away with the doll that he preferred. So this is mutually beneficial exchange. And I want to create just a small change, right, in this example. Let's suppose that we have Ming and Lou, and then I draw a line between them. And then they go through the whole process. Did we eliminate the gain from trade? Simply by having this line, let's call it a border between these two. Well, no, right? Drawing the line doesn't change anything. This trade is still mutually beneficial, right? So the argument for free trade is really just coming from the argument that trade is mutually beneficial, and adding a line, right, between those who are engaging in trade does not change the fact that we do benefit, right, from voluntary exchange. Now, there's another argument here I'm going to be drawing from Professor Rittenauer. Right, so Rittenauer makes the argument, right, about how division of labor makes us more productive, right, so that we can, in fact, be more productive, we get more stuff, right, and therefore we can satisfy more of our ends, right, because we are specializing according to comparative advantage, according to our levels of efficiency, and that allows us to then use resources more wisely. Right, so let's suppose that we have two people. So let's call one of these people Napoleon. Napoleon is very good at drawing. Call the other one Pedro. Pedro is very good at making cakes. Right? And, well, Napoleon would kind of like some cakes. Pedro would kind of like some drawings. Right? But they find that it is, in fact, to their advantage, right, for Pedro to bake the cake, for Napoleon to make the drawing, then for them to exchange to get the thing that they want. Right? So this would be specializing according to comparative advantage, trading to get the thing that we want. Now let's suppose we build a trade between, not a trade, we build a line between the two of them, right? Perhaps we build a wall between the two of them, make it very clear, right? This border exists, right? Or maybe we'll call it a wall and it's actually a fence, but it really doesn't matter, right? So, but they meet, right? And they manage to pass things right through this fence, right? Right? Is the benefit, right, from them specializing and then trading to get the things they want, is that erased, right, by the existence of this fence, this wall, this line? Well, no, right? Nothing in the argument changed simply by drawing a line between these two people or building a wall or building a fence. Right? So all of the gains that come, right, from the division of labor, right, and the trade that would be needed to make that specialization make sense, right, all those arguments still work. Even if we are dealing with cases where we're not producing. Again, the mutual benefit that comes from voluntary exchange, that argument still works. Right? Just drawing a line between people doesn't change any of this. Now, a point that I would make, kind of building on a point that Dr. Rittenauer made, right, is that you can also make just an observation that if we specialize, so we produce more than what we ourselves plan to consume, but we do this without trade, that is in fact a waste. And this is something that I've proven to myself this year with my garden, where I thought, okay, I have a very small patch. It's like 4 feet by 4 feet. Right? I don't know what that is in meters. Roughly 1 meter square, I think, just slightly larger than that. Right? And I decided I wanted half of it to be lettuce. Because I occasionally eat salad. Right? I didn't realize how successful I would be in growing lettuce, nor did I think about the fact that no one else in my household eats lettuce. Nor did I think about the fact that lettuce has this thing it does when it gets a little bit too old. Right? It's called bolting. All right, so instead of it being like a nice head, it gets very, very tall. And at that point, the lettuce is basically inedible because it's outrageously bitter. Right, so I ended up eating, I think I planted 10 heads of lettuce. I ate 1.5 of them. The other 8.5 were pure waste. It's just a waste of resources. I specialized in how I was using my garden bed, and then I did not engage in trade, right, to get anything I wanted at the end of the day, so it was a waste. Right, so I think we can say, based on what Rittenauer said, that really it only makes sense to specialize because trading is an option. Right? So what happens then if trading becomes less of an option? Well, it makes less sense to specialize. We specialize less, therefore we engage less in the division of labor. If we engage less in the division of labor, we're less productive on the whole, and therefore we end up materially poorer on the whole. Right? So we just showed, right, benefits from having free trade, and that also implied in us, if we start attacking, right, the trade that is necessary to make the division of labor work, right, then we end up poorer as a result. So we're already hinting toward, right, arguments against tariffs. So I think that kind of lays out perhaps the argument for free trade reasonably at this point. One more point before I finish. Again, drawing from what Dr. Rittenauer said, reminding ourselves of this because it is absolutely essential. This is a point that Mises makes, and that is that trade partners, right, one of the results of this from a social perspective, right, is that our well-being gets bound together. Right? I am made better off when you are made better off as a trade partner. And a consequence of this, right, is that it has increased the cost of conflict between us. Right? So there was a time, I don't think this effect is still in play, where there was what we talked about was the McDonald's effect. Right? I don't know you heard as much about it now because I think it became invalidated in the mid-1990s. But for several decades, there was this just empirical reality that any country that had a McDonald's in it hadn't attacked militarily any other country with a McDonald's, right, for several decades. And now I assume that's because, right, McDonald's has a significant diplomatic core or something like that. They're going into negotiating peace between countries. No, obviously not. That's not what's happening. Instead, the presence of a McDonald's, right, was a sign, right, was perhaps a symbol, but a signal, right, of trade relationships that were relatively close, right, between these different countries. And if we have trade relationships that are close, we don't want to mess with conflict because that is going to end up making us all worse off. And the closer we are together, the more obvious that is. Right? So if the cost of conflict is high, we're going to see more peaceful relationships. As somebody who prefers peace over war, right, this sounds good to me. So now let's turn to the case for tariffs and dismantle, right, some of the common arguments one by one. Right, so the first argument that I want to make for tariffs, I'm not going to end with the argument for it, right? But a very common argument, especially that you're hearing nowadays from places like the Trump administration, is the balance of trade concern. So first, just to lay out what the balance of trade is, for those that may not know the precise definition. So the balance of trade is the difference between the value of exports and the value of imports for your country. Right? So if you add up everything that your country exports to other countries, right, what is, in the United States, the dollar value of that? Right? Add up everything we import, what's the dollar value of that? Right? The subtraction between the two, that is your balance of trade. Now, if your exports are greater than your imports, when you do the subtraction, you get a positive number. I would call this a trade surplus, right, which means then on net, money is flowing into your economy. Right? And then if it's the opposite, right, that imports are greater than exports, then that means you have a trade deficit, right, which means that on net, money is flowing out of your country. Now, this argument for tariffs, which I'll get to fleshing that in just a moment, right, this is not a new argument at all. This would be the argument that we had to deal with 200 years ago, right? The classic mercantilist argument said, well, if we have trade surpluses, that's basically the same, right, as our country making a profit. Right? We think of exports as being your revenue for the country, think of imports as being your costs for the country. Do the subtraction, it's positive. We've made a profit, that's good, we've won the trade game. Right? On the other hand, if we have deficits, then we've lost the trade game because revenue is less than our costs, right? This is not a good thing. And this is exactly the argument you hear from President Trump a lot of the time, right? So to quote him, right, he says, "We've been the foolish country for so long with this free trade, but it's not free trade because it's, it just doesn't work." He's amazingly eloquent. I mean, it's not working. You look at the deficits we have. Right, so this would be the graph of the trade balance. The black line at the very top of the graph is 0. Which means since this graph starts right around 1992, yeah, it's always negative. This is a monthly number here. So there is not, in fact, any month since 1992, when I was probably like 9 years old at that point, and I suspect most people in this room were not born at that point, the US has been running a trade deficit all of this time. Right? Now, varying amounts, sure, but we've always been running a trade deficit, right? So certainly if we believe that trade deficits are equivalent to losses, right, that means, we've been losing ever since NAFTA started around the mid-1990s. It's a terrible trade deal, and it led to all of these losses. Now, I do want to make just one quick observation. You may notice that there is one specific spike downward that looks worse than the rest, right? Happening here in 2025, early 2025. That's when it's actually very easy to explain. And this gets into kind of what the intended effects of tariffs would be in relation to imports and how it can not always work as intended. Right? So there was an announcement early in 2025 where President Trump declared we're going to have Liberation Day, right? April 1st, 2025. And Liberation Day meant that we were going to kill free trade by implementing all kinds of tariffs. Right? Now, he announced this a couple months ahead of time, right? Apparently forgetting that entrepreneurs are forward-looking. And so you have a bunch of manufacturers in the United States that rely on things like imports of raw materials that say, wow, my costs are going to go up a lot, right, if I import after April. Let's just import a lot in March and February and get in before the tariffs. So at least I have something that I can work off of for a little while before these tariffs possibly get lessened or go away or whatever, right? So you see this enormous increase in imports that happens, right around that February, March time, and that ended up showing up here in a significant trade deficit. Okay. So what then is the purpose here? Now this is counter, right, to the purpose of what the tariffs would be, right? If you tax something, people generally do less of it, right? So put a tax on imports, we would expect, right, less importing to happen, right? So we do see that things aren't quite as bad, right, in April as they were in March, right? But it doesn't seem like things corrected quite as much as planned. Okay. All right. Right. So, but the idea is let's punish, right, imports. That should fix the trade balance, right? Help discourage people from importing, so we end up with a greater balance. Okay. All right. So, what is the answer to this? Because there is a certain superficial, I guess, believability, right, to this. Right? Like, I like thinking in terms of profit and loss. I'm an economist, right? So if we want to think about countries, what does a country sell to the rest of the world? It does feel like that might be exports, right? What do we buy from the rest of the world? That feels like that might be imports. Superficially, this feels like there may be something to it. Right? Well, Mises makes, unsurprisingly, a very good point. Right? And his point is this, right? He says, first, right, what we need to think of this as, when we have, right, this trade deficit, what's actually happening, right, is that, say in this case, the United States, right, is we're exporting money. Right? Just we don't count that when we do the trade balance. Right? So we have made the decision, right, then to export money. Right? So he makes the point. He says an excess in the exports of money is not the product of an unhappy concatenation of circumstances that befalls a nation like an act of God. Right? This is not some accident that this happens. Instead, right, it is the result of the fact that the residents of the country concerned are intent upon reducing the amount of money held and upon buying goods instead. Right, so all this is really evidence of, and as far as it's a result of voluntary exchange, is that Americans have decided that we don't want to hold as much money as we do. Right? We would rather, right, buy goods from the rest of the world, and that the rest of the world is perfectly happy, right, to accept that money in exchange for the goods they will provide to us. Right? So this is just a result then of voluntary exchange, which is not something that we should condemn. Now, I do think there is perhaps a point here where we can say, well, maybe there's something fishy going on. And we could point out, well, maybe the reason the residents of the United States are intent upon reducing the amount of money held is that we have a central bank that just keeps increasing the amount of money inside the United States, right? So we have this continual increase in the supply of money rather than, well, we're perfectly happy to give this up, right, to get something more valuable from the rest of the world. So that could be part of what's going on. I do wonder, right, what would happen if we stopped printing money so quickly? Right? Might we see people decide that maybe they don't want to decrease their holdings of money quite so quickly? Unfortunately, the Fed is not going to run that experiment for me, I suspect. Right. Now, there's also another point that comes in, and this is a point that Anthony Davies makes. He says, another thing that gets missed here, right, is that while we have this money flowing abroad, right, through trade, this is missing the investment side of things. Right? So part of what happens is that the rest of the world likes to invest in the United States, because the United States has a reasonably reliable stock market for the most part. Our central banks make sure of it. Right? So it's a good place to invest. Well, if you want to invest in the United States, you need the dollars to do it. So what do? Right, you sell a bunch of goods to the US, right? That money goes back to your home. Now we have that money available to invest, right, in the United States. This is not necessarily a problem. It's just that what we're exporting is, in effect, shares on the New York Stock Exchange, right, which would not show up, right, in these numbers. Now, Davies does answer one potential concern here. He says, what happens when foreigners buy up all of the American companies? So, well, that's easy. We just make more of them. It's something America is actually very good at, right, is creating new businesses. Okay. All right, so that is another point that we can make about this. So if we wanted to kind of sum this up, right, on a fundamental level, this is not something we really need to worry about. Right? It's just reflecting right, the preferences of buyers and sellers. Right? And as a result, this is really just reflecting right, the exchanges that we were making. Now, if we're particularly concerned about this, perhaps right, we could instruct Chair Warsh to perhaps be a bit tighter on the money supply, but I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. Okay. Right? At the very least, tariffs are not going to make people better off if we're implementing to deal with this. So what's another argument then for why we might want to consider tariffs? One thing that I love right, about the American political environment today right, is how much it confirms the horseshoe theory right, of politics. Right, so President Trump loves tariffs, and I believe, in fact, he has gone on record saying he loves tariffs. I think that may be a direct quote. Right? Somebody else who loves tariffs right, would be Senator Bernie Sanders, a well-known capitalist, of course. No, he's like the one avowed socialist in the Senate who will actually admit it. Right? He also argues against free trade consistently. He doesn't like free trade. Why? Right? Because in his mind, it means that American workers are forced to compete right, with workers abroad that are being paid less. And so we need to level the playing field. We need to protect American workers by throwing tariffs on to make all of these foreign goods more expensive. Right? It's going to be good for the American worker. Okay. Now, again, superficially, this feels like there's something to it. Right? Because after all, if you do make foreign goods more expensive, what do consumers do? Right? Okay, I was going to buy this good from China, but now it's significantly more expensive. Well, maybe I'll buy the American-made good instead, right? Which was more expensive before the tariff. Now it's the cheaper option, thanks to the tariff pushing up that cost. Right? So I will switch to buying more domestic goods. There's certainly a logic to this. Right? So doesn't it, in fact, help domestic workers, domestic producers, and the like? So Mises makes a couple points related to this. Right, so the first one is that any benefit right, that your domestic workers get or domestic companies get when they're protected right, from foreign competition raises cost to consumers who are obviously going to be hurt. Right, so, okay, maybe we are helping the American worker, but we're harming the American consumer by exactly that same amount. Right? It's actually not exactly, it's more than that. We'll get to that. Right, so we're not actually making anybody better off. We're just reallocating resources. That, in fact, is going to make things worse here in a moment. Right? So, but then you can make the argument, well, but now the American worker has this money, or they're going to spend it as well, right? So we've not actually lost anything, right? It's just going to stay here in the American economy. This is great, right? Mises gives this fantastic analogy for this argument. He said, this is like the man who asks an innkeeper for a gift of $10. But he assures him it won't cost him anything, because he's going to spend it all at the end. It's still going to cost the innkeeper something. It's just going to end up being in the form of goods rather than in the form of the money that he hands over, right? So what it comes down to then is that domestic buyers are not going to be made better off. They're going to be made worse off, and they're going to be made worse off specifically because of the attack that's going to be happening on the division of labor. So why were we engaging in that trade in the first place? Why is it that it was cheaper for us to buy from abroad than to buy at home? Well, again, we can go back to what Dr. Rittenauer talked about yesterday. Right? Well, the reason things are going to be cheaper is because it is more efficient, right, for us to buy from abroad, for us to specialize in our area of comparative advantage, let others specialize in theirs. Happens to be on the other side of a border. That doesn't change the fact that we're going to be more productive if each of us specializes according to our comparative advantage. Right? But once we attack that, once we say, no, right, we need to make sure that we're producing this particular good at home, right, now we are becoming less productive, less efficient, right, and therefore poorer on the whole. Right, so it is true, some may gain while others lose, but on net, right, the total production, we're going to see greater losses. But Mises makes another point. He says, well, this is all still short run. In the long run, what's going to happen if we provide this protection for workers and for this industry? Well, if this industry then becomes unusually profitable, what we'd expect to happen is that we'd have more competitors enter that industry domestically. Right, so we have additional production happening here. Note, this is more resources being poured into an area that is not our comparative advantage. Right? So in terms of actual productivity, we're getting worse as this happens. But then for those in that industry, all of their profits they were making, thanks to the protection, get eaten away right, by this domestic competition. So the only way that they can stay protected, that they can keep those unusual profits, is if they're protected not just from foreign competition through things like tariffs, they have to be protected from domestic competition as well. Right? So we have to do things like imposing licenses, charters, what have you, right, to prevent people from entering these industries. Otherwise, new entrants are going to eat away at the high wages, are going to eat away at the high profits in this industry. And so even these gains are temporary and going to be eaten away over time. Okay. And what are we left with in the end? The erosion of the division of labor and being less productive. One more common argument, it would be the infant industry argument. So this one is a slight variation on this domestic protection argument, but it's a little bit more nuanced. So in the United States, we would often associate the infant industry argument with people like Alexander Hamilton, who makes this case in his report on manufacturers. So the idea is this, right? We want to make sure, right, that we get industry off the ground. Now, this is particularly when we're trying to encourage things like manufacturing. The problem is that we are a relatively young country. Right? We're not very developed. And we're having to compete, right, with all of these big factories that already exist, say in America's case. Oh, they already exist over in Britain. Right? It's just not fair that we have to face that competition. But I bet we could, right, compete with them once we become more mature in our own development. The problem is we're not there yet. So we're this little baby infant, right? And like any baby infant, I've had 4 of my own, right? You don't just like throw them to the wolves. No, you protect them. Right? You watch over them. You keep them safe, right? So we build walls around them. Put them in a crib. What does that crib look like? It looks like tariffs and trade restrictions. Right? So we need to protect this baby industry, make sure that it can grow up to be mature. Right? So we protect it. Right? And then the idea is that after, right, the baby industry grows up, we start removing, right, all of these protections so that then they can thrive, right, in the world. Okay. Mises makes a point about this. He says, well, let's go ahead and allow, right, that maybe if we're interested in productivity, what matters, right, is whether the factory is built in the right place in terms of having the available resources that it needs. Right? So let's say that original factory, the old one that's over there in the UK, let's say it was actually built in the wrong place from today's point of view. In fact, like we found out that here in the Americas, we have, right, the natural resources more available. We have a skilled labor supply that could, in fact, run this factory. We just don't have the factory here. Right? Well, does it then follow that we should rip down the old factory back in the UK and build one here? And Mises says, oh, no. Right? Because that old factory does exist. It is a resource, right, that is providing some kind of benefit. And so as he says in Human Action, the truth is, right, the establishment of an infant industry is advantageous from the economic point of view only if the superiority of that new location is so momentous that it outweighs the disadvantages resulting from the abandonment, right, of the non-convertible, non-transferable capital goods invested in the older established plants. Right? So it only makes sense, right, for us to have this infant industry be born here in the United States, right, if it's so much more productive in the US that it makes sense for us to just burn down the plant in Britain. Well, here the point that we can make is fairly obvious, and that is that entrepreneurs are forward-looking. Right? So an entrepreneur that sees it is outrageously momentously advantageous, right, to build in the US is going to sell the plant that's over in the UK and build in the US. So they're going to do this. You don't need all these protections to convince them to do this to earn the greater profit. Right? So in this case, where the infant industry is actually beneficial, all of the trade restrictions are totally unnecessary. Right? And the only thing that it would end up providing is hurting the division of labor, making us less productive and poorer. Right? So again, we do not need it. So let's get then, with our remaining time, into a couple of the more nuanced, kind of trickier arguments in favor of trade restrictions or tariffs. Right, so one of them that is particularly common amongst the Trump administration, again, people like I mentioned Treasury Secretary Bessent before, is this idea that, well, it's not that we love tariffs in themselves. Maybe the president does, but not everybody in the administration does. It's that we need to have some kind of reciprocity. Right? So we have this idea of reciprocal tariffs. Right? And that was the way that the Liberation Day tariffs in 2025 were sold. Right? Like you have this slide where they're here, all of the different tariff rates, right? And these are all labeled as reciprocal tariffs. Right? All right. So the idea of the reciprocal tariff, we can appeal here somewhat to Peter Navarro, who is a economic advisor for President Trump, especially more during his first term. Right? The point that Peter Navarro makes, he said, well, a lot of this theory that people like Engelhardt might talk about at Mises U involves assuming that we have this world of free trade, right? And then you layer tariffs on top of that, and oh, look how much worse things get. Where he says, but that's not the real world. Right? In the real world, right, there are already tariffs, there are subsidies, they're distorting, right, what production looks like. Right? So what we need to do then is have reciprocal tariffs, right, to correct, right, the distortion. So that'd be one argument, this idea, well, we're trying to just correct, right, the errors that other policies are trying to create. Another argument for reciprocal tariffs actually comes from Adam Smith, right? So 200 years have been fighting against tariffs, and Adam Smith did give a little bit of ground as a case where maybe temporarily some tariffs might make sense, where he says, if you're using tariffs as a bargaining chip, right, to encourage other countries to drop their trade restrictions, right, if you're a good statesman that can pull this off, that might be okay temporarily. And we see this type of Adam Smith argument built into a number of, okay, we call them free trade agreements, so if you read them, they're clearly not free by any means. But at the very least, this idea of reciprocity is often built into them, right? So if you look at the old General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that came out after World War II, and then the World Trade Organization being the, I guess, the successor to that, one of the things that it does, it allows, right, for reciprocal tariffs as kind of an enforcement mechanism. So you tariff me, I'll tariff you. The idea being it's a big enough punishment that then neither of us are going to tariff each other. Right, so what is our response then to this? Right, well, the first thing that I want to respond to is specifically those Liberation Day tariffs. Right, so the Trump administration was kind enough, right, to actually publish, right, the formula that they used, right, to calculate those reciprocal tariffs. So I want you to see this because we like formulas. Austrians are famous for this, right? Particularly if there are Greek letters in them that make them more scientific. Right, so this is the formula that was used. So on the left-hand side, you see delta tau. The I here indicates that it's country-specific. So I would be the specific country you're talking about. Delta tau would be the recommended change in tariffs. Right? Then on the right-hand side, the way we're going to calculate that, the numerator of that fraction would be your trade balance. Right? Now, I mark it here as the trade deficit. It's going to be a negative number, so it's exports minus imports. Then in the denominator of the fraction, we have these three elements that get multiplied together. The first is the price elasticity of US imports. I'll talk more about exactly what that means here in a second. Then US tariff pass-through, right? And then finally the level of imports, right, from the country that we're tariffing. Right? Now, remember the idea of reciprocal tariffs is if you tariff me, I tariff you. You may notice my note here on the slide. We calculated your reciprocal tariffs without in any way including the tariffs you have on us in the formula. This, as my kids would say, this feels a little sus, right? One would expect that if it's a reciprocal tariff where I'm tariffing you because you tariffed me, I should at least account for your level of tariffs somehow in my calculation. But it's not there. It's not there. Right, so what is this actually? Right? What is this actually doing? Well, when I first saw this formula, the first thing that struck me was my note, there are no other country tariffs here. But then I had to spend a little bit of time thinking, okay, what is this doing? Right? Well, I am the master of Algebra 1, so I know that one thing you can do with this formula is I can multiply both sides by the denominator of that fraction and it still holds. Right? Then I can also rearrange terms amongst multiplication. What is that? The commutative property of multiplication. Right? And then once I did that, it became clear what they were actually doing. So let's look at it. Right, so here we have the left-hand side now is just right, the original left-hand side and then the denominator rearranged right from the right-hand side before. So I want to go kind of term by term and talk about what happens when we multiply these together. Right, so the first thing here would be the change in tariff rates, right, that is suggested. Right? We multiply that by the second term, that is the pass-through in tariffs to US prices. What that means is how much of those tariffs are going to come through right, to American prices. So for example, if I put a 10% tariff there and say the pass-through is 50%, then that means US prices for those imports will go up by 5%. That's half of the 10%. Right, now, if that fee here is 100%, that means that every single percentage point of tariff gets passed through to the American consumer. Right? If it's 50%, then it would be half of it. If it's 0, then that means none of it comes through. We've managed to force the rest of the world to pay the tariff, that kind of thing. Now, when you look deeper into the notes on this, they did just assume a value for fee of, I believe it was 0.24, or no, 0.25, because it's 1/4. That makes the next step easier. All right, so and that isn't actually based on any data whatsoever. They don't cite anything. They just, oh, we like 1/4, so stick that in there. Okay. All right, so that's what the first two do together. Put them together, that's how much our US price is going to change, US import price is going to change because of these tariffs. Right? Now add the third term to it, that epsilon. Right, so again, we're educated, we know that that is not an E, that's an epsilon, it's Greek. Right? So we multiply that through, the epsilon would be the, that's the elasticity of US imports with respect to prices. That's telling us in percentage terms, right, once we multiply that by the other two, how much are US imports going to change? Right, so the number they ended up using here was 4, right, which is very convenient because then if you multiply 0.25 by 4, those just cancel out. It makes the math easy. Right? Again, no justification from the data whatsoever, but that's okay. All right. Right, so the assumption here, 4 being then like a 1% change in prices, right, would lead to a 4% change in imports. Right, so we've got the first threes, put those all together, that's telling us as a percentage how much our American imports going to change when we put these tariffs in place. Right? Last thing we do is multiply by the level of imports. So put it all together, right? In dollar terms, how much are American imports going to change? Let's set that equal to the trade deficit. What are they doing? They're not reciprocating tariffs. They're trying to get rid of the trade deficit. Who cares about that? Not Adam Smith. Right? Not even, weirdly, Peter Navarro. Right? No, it's the mercantilists, right? So this is President Trump saying, oh, it's, all of these things are losses because we have these trade deficits. And the formula is built to try to get rid of those trade deficits. Right? So I guess the first point that I would make is that one thing that has happened, right, with this idea of reciprocal tariffs, right, is that it has been adopted, right, as a rhetoric, right, but it's totally a lie, right, from the people that are advocating for tariffs. Right? Now, what about those that are actually honest about it, that actually mean it? Well, here Mises would make a simple point, and he says that unilateral free trade, even if the rest of the world tariffs us, right, unilateral free trade is still what's best, right, for us. Right? So the question then becomes, why is it that if other countries want to hurt themselves, we have an obligation to hurt ourselves, right, to convince them to stop doing it? Instead, I suspect that Mises would say that the best thing we can do is engage in reasonable discussion, right, with these other people and try to convince them that they are in fact hurting themselves. And that's how you convince them to lower their trade barriers. If they don't do it, well, then that hurts them. It doesn't really hurt us. Okay. All right. So that would be a 1. I think of time, yeah, wow, I spent more time on that than I expected. So I need to deal with then with probably the hardest argument in the next 4 minutes. Right? And this is the one where I think Mises certainly, and I'd probably say even myself, is willing to give the most ground. Right? It's the national security argument. Right? So to make it extremely stark, right? Let's suppose that some enemy, right? I'm an American, so I'm going to think that way. Suppose some enemy of the United States says, if you don't tariff us at 100%, we're going to bomb all your major cities. In that case, I would advocate for tariffs of 100%. I'm not so dedicated to free trade that I'm going to say, yes, it's worth bombing everybody. Okay, right, so okay, I'm willing to give that. And Mises also, not quite in those terms, gives a little ground here. Because he says in Human Action, he says the bulk of expenditure for national defense is defrayed by the Treasury out of the public revenue, but occasionally another procedure is chosen. It happens sometimes that the nation's preparedness to repel aggression depends on the existence of certain branches of industry, which would be absent in the unhampered market. Right? So he's acknowledging there may be some industries we need to have domestically available to prepare for things like aggression from abroad. He says these industries must be subsidized, right? And the subsidies granted are to be considered as any other armaments expenditure. And this is the kind of thing where I read this, and I know sometimes Mises will make an argument, but then talk about why it's wrong. And I checked after, I could not find where he talked about why this was wrong. So I'm assuming, right, that he is saying this as actually genuinely advocating this position. He says their character remains the same, right, if the government grants them indirectly by the imposition of an import duty, So in other words, if we put in tariffs to try to protect these key domestic industries that are needed for national security, right, that's the same as us basically subsidizing them. Now, it changes some of who bears the burden of the cost, right? But in terms of the effect, right, this is something that Mises does seem to be advocating for. Okay, right. And now, this is somewhat understandable. First, we need to remember that Mises was not an anarcho-capitalist. Right? He did believe that defense was a viable purpose, right, for the government. So, how are you going to make sure you can defend yourself? This is the argument that he makes. Now, I think, though, we can make some arguments against this to at least some degree. Right? And so one point that we can make, right, is that for many things that are kind of tagged as being important for national defense, right, many of them are natural resources, right, where in fact you might better be able to make an argument for importing them rather than using your own reserves. And so here I remember a discussion I had with my dad back in like the 1990s. I was getting interested in politics. I was like, oh, well, what about our dependence on foreign oil? And he said, well, at least we're using theirs and not ours. Which is a fair point, right? If it's something where I can use up what you have or I can use up what I have, let's use up what you have first, right? And then I'm okay if you attack me. Okay, this actually makes some degree of sense. Now, another point we can make, and this is based somewhat on what Dr. Terrell showed when talking about calculation, we have all these interconnections between industries, right? Which then creates an issue. If I identify that a couple of these are necessary for national defense, doesn't that imply that everything else connected with that is also necessary for national defense? And when that happens, then we can start using this national defense argument very much like the reciprocal tariff argument, right? Very dishonestly, where it's not actually the thing we're concerned with. So right now in the United States, right, we have justified a 25% tariff on the basis of national defense, right, on kitchen cabinets and vanities. Because I know every time I walk into Lowe's and I see the kitchen cabinets and I see they're made in Vietnam, I start worrying about how our enemies have now made us susceptible to attack, right? Like, no, this is just a legal thing you can do, right? You sneak around all of the restrictions on other possible ways to get tariffs in place. You start using national defense as an excuse. All right, so I think there I am certainly out of time. All right, so I hope that gives us something to think about in terms of the benefit of free trade, right? Mutually beneficial exchange, regardless of the line, and how tariffs erode that. Thank you very much.